Before we start today's story, we would like to request you to help out our friend's new channel Timeless Audio Tales, where he puts together some amazing stories. The link is in the description box, so please visit the channel and hit the subscribe button. Now let's start the story. I awoke on a cold, rocky ledge, feeling the air moving over my skin, making the hairs on my body stand on end. It was dark, but I could just make out the rough outline of a doorway or passage to my left, or perhaps above my head, given the way I was lying. The sound of flowing water reached my ears from the other direction. Out of the darkness, a woman's voice spoke. Your old life is over, and your new life has begun. You will find yourself young, healthy, and unimpaired. You have been judged and found to be less despicable than most, despite many mistakes made early in your previous life. I will be watching you and the others you shall meet. When I have something important to tell you, we shall meet in your dreams. A small cache of gifts has been left to help you survive. Then she asked, May I ask what I should call you? Before I could answer, she continued, You may call me Mother. Above all, my command to you is this: use your mind. With that, a faint breeze stirred, followed by a sudden, sharp tremor. The ground beneath me shook as a crack opened high in the far wall, revealing what appeared to be a long, low cave with an uneven floor. As I swung my legs down from the rock ledge where I had been lying, I noticed a small pile of items resting on what looked like a piece of dark canvas. I reached down and found a small sack containing a flint and steel, a simple fixed-blade knife, a wooden cup, a heavy iron pot with a sturdy handle, an enormous bundle of black nylon cord, and a large piece of thick canvas, roughly 6 feet wide and 20 feet long. A hole in the center suggested it could serve as a poncho. I draped it over my shoulders, folding up the excess fabric at the front and back, securing it around my waist with a length of cord cut from the bundle. I also used 2 more pieces to tie the fire-starting kit and the knife around my neck. At the bottom of the pile was another piece of canvas, about 8 feet square. I wasn't sure what it was intended for, perhaps a blanket, a door, or something else entirely. For now, I folded it and set it on the sleeping ledge to keep it out of the way. Determined to explore my surroundings, I kept my right hand in contact with the cave wall as I walked its perimeter, carefully observing everything I could. I made sure to look both up and down as I moved. Before long, I came across a break in the wall where a small stream of water trickled along the floor for a short distance before disappearing through a wide crack. It was large enough for me to fit through, but the darkness beyond was impenetrable. I hesitated. Venturing in blindly would be reckless. I doubted Mother would be pleased if I met my end through sheer foolishness. As I continued my exploration, I discovered 14 more rock ledges of various sizes carved into the walls. Some were just above head height. Acting on a hunch, I reached up to feel their surfaces and found shallow depressions in each. I smiled. Grease lamps. These were ready-made lamps, waiting to be filled with animal fat and twisted plant fibers for wicks. All I needed now was fire. I moved along the cave's edge until I reached the entrance. It was narrow and twisted back on itself before opening into the outside world about 4 feet above the ground. The cave mouth was set into an overgrown cliff face. I could hear frogs nearby, suggesting a wetland wasn't far off. Keeping my right hand on the cliff face, I cautiously moved forward, searching for anything useful and watching for anything that could pose a danger. Rounding an outcrop, I stopped short, my pulse spiking. A bear. For a moment, I thought I was in serious trouble, but then I realized it wasn't moving. The recent earthquake had brought down a large tree, which had crushed a foraging black bear beneath it. A windfall. Its fur, meat, and organs would be invaluable. Even better, the bear had been digging up wild potatoes when it met its fate, leaving me with another unexpected bounty. Its head had been crushed by the tree, making it easier to work quickly. I stripped off the hide, rolled it up, and carried it back to the cave to deal with later. Returning to the carcass, I set about harvesting as much meat and fat as I could. Lacking a proper container, I cut a 3-foot section from the front of my poncho, doubled it over into a square, punched small holes along the edges, and threaded cord through them. When turned inside out, it became a makeshift carry bag. I loaded it with bear fat and meat, then hurried back to the cave before scavengers caught the scent. Back inside, I rinsed both myself and my poncho in the cold stream running through the cave. The water was sweet and fresh, not overly mineral-laden. The sun was setting. I needed to start a fire, but that would have to wait until morning. For now, I secured the bear's tenderloins in the flowing water to keep them fresh, tying them to a cord weighted down by the bag of fat. Lying on my sleeping ledge, I let my mind run through what I needed to do next. Fire. Without it, my survival would be much harder. Food. I could go a day or 2 without eating, but beyond that, I would weaken. A weapon. I needed at least something to defend myself. A door. something to keep out unwelcome visitors. Exploration. I had to scout the land around my cave. The frogs outside reassured me. A wetland meant food and plant resources were nearby. A simple throwing stick or a bolo would be easy to make. If I was lucky, I'd find a chalk cliff. Chert deposits would allow me to craft better tools. Heating chalk would give me quicklime, which could be useful for sealing my doorway. As I drifted toward sleep, I silently thanked Mother. Her gifts were deeply appreciated. Day 2. I awoke to the first light of dawn filtering through my cave skylight. Rising, I washed my face, relieved myself, dressed, and set out to greet the day. Cautiously, I checked the site where the bear had fallen. The scavengers had done their work. There wasn't much left. Instead of approaching, I turned and headed in the opposite direction. No point in testing my luck against whatever had been feasting there overnight. I carried my knife, fire-starting kit, and some cord, making my way toward the sound of the frogs. Not far away, perhaps a quarter mile, I found what I was looking for, a wetlands area, thick with cattails and water lilies. A small woodland bordered the swamp, its floor carpeted in green sphagnum moss. A sphagnum moss swamp was dangerous. It could easily conceal hidden branches that might pierce an unwary traveler. But I knew this place would be a valuable resource. Dried moss would burn well and could also serve as bedding. My priority was fire. I needed charred wood, so I searched for a tree struck by lightning. As I moved through the forest, I marked my path with double horizontal cuts on tree trunks about 6 feet high, ensuring I could find my way back. Eventually, I spotted a lightning-scarred tree. I climbed it carefully, harvesting blackened wood to fill my fire kit. Before leaving, I gathered an armful of the driest moss I could find, as well as cattail fronds for fibers. By the time I returned to the cave, I was ready to attempt my first fire. Mother had given me a second chance. I wasn't going to waste it. I set aside the moss near the door to dry. It would be insulation, toilet paper, lamp wick, short-lived scrubbies for the dishes, and anything else I could think of. I searched out a depression in the floor near my skylight to make my fire. I realized that I'd neglected to retrieve any firewood. Fat lot of flame would do with nothing to feed it. I went out once more to gather wood. Squaw wood is composed of dry, dropped, or hanging dead branches. If the branches are still attached to the tree, then it can't be damp from the ground. Now can it? I went back to the swamp and selected 2 dead trees still standing in the water, without bark. They were almost laying down, but not quite. I pulled them free of the swamp and hauled them back to camp, carrying the small remaining root balls and dragging the tips. I did this twice more, then searched out smaller wood branches to get the fire started with. Note that I began harvesting wood the furthest that I could from camp first, to preserve the easier to harvest wood for a time when I was tired or sick. There were many dead trees at the edge of a closed-off portion of the swamp. It must have shifted or grown relatively recently. After returning to the cave, I looked down at my mud-streaked legs. I had a thought about footgear and felt for winter clothing. I returned to the bear's carcass and cut away at the paws until they came free. I wanted to tie them high in a tree until they dried. When I needed hide glue, I could boil them. I needed lime to dehair hides as well to harvest the hair. From the looks of the plant life around the cave, it was middle to late summer. Hopefully I had enough time to build up my larder. With my arm full of firewood, I returned to my fire pit to be. I emptied my fire bag onto a flat place on the cave floor, retrieved my flint and steel, carefully set some charred wood over some wood shavings, and had at it. Within a half hour, I had a small blaze going. I carefully fed it, then went outside for one of my dead and dried deadfall trees. I bashed it against the floor to break off a few pieces, then put the smaller end in the fire. I filled the pot half full of meat, and then to the top with water. It was put near the fire to cook while I ensured that I would have an easier time of staring the fire the next time. I carefully cut a strip 3 fingers wide and 6 fingers long from the bottom of my poncho. Using 2 sticks, I carefully browned, then charred it in sections so that if I burned up one section, the rest would remain usable. I made charcloth. I tied the sections into round bundles and put all but one on a dry shelf. While waiting for dinner to cook, I used my cup to almost fill another depression in the floor with water, then dropped in several handfuls of raw bear fat. I noticed several hand-sized stones near the root ball of the tree that fell and took out the bear. I went out to pick up a double handful. These I dropped in the fire. When dinner was almost ready, I used a stick to retrieve them one by one and skitter them across the floor and into the fat pit, being careful to stay low in case one of them exploded from the sudden cooling. With just 3 rocks, I had it simmering nicely. My bear soup may not have been a balanced meal, nor very tasty because there was no salt in it whatsoever, but it certainly hit the spot. After eating a couple cups full, I refilled the pot with more water and pulled it a bit away from the fire. I cleaned the cup out with a bit of moss which I pitched into the fire, then carefully dipped out the rendered bear fat, a quarter cup at a time, and filled the lamp depressions. I had a handful of moss soaking in the hot fat in one of the depressions. I kept switching out rocks until I got tired. Then I put the root ball in the fire for a nice, slow night log. As I lay back, thinking over the day, I was happy with what I'd done. The next day would be a firewood and moss day. A nice, big bale of moss backed by a couple of big logs would make a perfectly respectable door. I tried to get my lanterns going as well. Maybe I'd work on fire tongs or some wood cutlery. I had a good start. I remembered my thank you, mother, and fell asleep. Day 3. What should I be thinking about? I had shelter, food, water, and fire. I needed weapons, not only for defense but for hunting. It would be tedious cutting down a straight sapling, but it had more chance of gaining me a good spear. I also needed to go foraging. A digging stick was simple to construct compared to a spear. I tended the fire, then had a couple cups of bear meat porridge, refilled the pot, and headed out to do some quick moss and firewood harvesting. I thought about how to better use the trees I was hauling. If I just burned off the root balls, they could be used for a travois to haul heavier loads than I could carry, such as a deer carcass. If I stacked the poles against the cliff wall half-teepee fashion and covered with hides, they would make a smoke house, which would preserve meat much more efficiently than drying racks would. I spent half the day harvesting loads of moss and water-killed trees. The afternoon was spent digging potatoes and looking for likely hardwood saplings. I didn't find any the first day. However, I did find a half-dozen 2-inch rocks that I could fashion into a pair of bolas. I accidentally tasted the water at the end of the swamp which held the dead trees. It was brackish. Somewhere around that section of the swamp was a salt deposit, and I was determined to find it. Regrettably, it was getting dark, and night was not the time to be scouting new territory. The predators come out at night. As soon as I made it back to the cave, I made the bolas. I felt more secure with a distance weapon in my hands. I spent a couple hours eating and rendering bear fat before going to bed. I said my prayers and fell asleep. Day 4. I rose, tended the fire, ate, dressed, and headed for the salt swamp. I had cut a strip of canvas from the rear of my poncho to make a shoulder strap for the foraging bag. It left me with both hands free. Once I discovered it, it was pretty obvious where the salt was coming from. There were gray-brown strata in the hillside. I filled the bag several times before I was too pooped to do more. I made 7 trips that day and vowed to make more the next. I had a large mound of salt filling one of the larger storage ledges. That evening, I slowly tended the fire, ate, and began wrapping a huge bale of moss into a plug for my door. I remembered to bury a handle in it to pop it loose, or I'd have to destroy it to get outside. It was a snug friction fit. The handle gave a good brace point for a staff to prop it firmly in place, using a defect in the floor to brace against. I said my prayers, giving thanks for the beautiful gift that day, and quickly fell asleep. Day 5. I painfully rose, tended the fire, ate, dressed, and left with the carry bag. In hindsight, I should have made another and constructed a yoke to carry a balanced load, but I neglected to think it through. After filling the shelf to overflowing, I stopped harvesting salt and continued looking for a spear shaft or two. I found a small valley filled with closely crowded young straight saplings that had no branches until their tops. They varied in size from 4 inches across the base to little whips. I identified several that were about 2 fingers across the base. I cut 3 of them, skinned them while they would slip the bark, and carried them back to the cave to dry. I hung them from a piece of cord from the skylight so that they would dry in the wood smoke. That done, I looked for reeds the size of my little finger. I wanted something to sit on to keep my ass off the cold floor of the cave. The answer was a Cherokee backrest. It takes some 100 reeds close to 2 feet long, strung together into a tight mat. That became an on-again, off-again project that I pursued for over a month. Whenever I explored or harvested, I cut off a few more reeds and stuffed them in my carry sack. I was tired of wondering where the water in the cave was going. I harvested 4 of last year's cottony cattail, heads on fairly stiff reeds. I gently soaked them in bear fat and lit one in the fire. It made an excellent, though drippy, torch. I'd use less bear fat next time. Besides, it was a precious resource. When would I harvest another bear? Holding the torch high over me, I stuck my head through the hole and looked around. The water ran in a rivulet down a sandy beach to an underground lake. I was glad that I hadn't been using it as a toilet. The lake's surface went out over 20 meters before the cave ceiling sloped down to meet it. The cave was perhaps 8 meters wide. It was a beautiful spot. I'd have to debate with myself whether or not to use it, which would no doubt degrade its beauty. That night, I prayed once more to Mother, but this time I asked a question. Mother, I have need. I have seen the beautiful water cavern that my spring drains into. Please, Mother, I need to know your intent. Is this to be a place of worship or a resource? I hesitate to defame anything so beautiful and likely taking thousands of years to create. With this, I fell asleep as if I had been switched off. I found myself standing before a giantess. She was handsome and had short white hair. Green veins ran through her silvery skin. Her eyes, I could not look into her eyes. You have done well to ask me. This is the type of behavior that I cherish. Your cave shows little of the enormous, slow-moving underground river that flows into the sea. You may use it as you will as long as feces and offal are not dumped there. It is a cold cave, and the air does not stir. It would be good for storage. Sleep now. Day 6. When I awoke, I was sleeping on a tan bear skin. I was amazed at the gift. It would have taken me several weeks to tan the thing, and I would never have approached the quality that I felt between my fingers. When I rose, I kicked something that wasn't there the night before. There was a tall stack of canvas, another huge hank of cord, and a good steel axe. I was curious why I was given these gifts. I could only guess that I was being rewarded for not being an ecological idiot. When I walked outside to void myself, I found myself knowing that a half-day's walk that way was a chalk cliff with chert nodules exposed at the cliff's foot. I turned and looked at a stand of bushes at the verge of the woods and knew that they would make wonderful baskets. I also knew how to weave baskets. What an amazing gift. I spent the day as I was commanded to, using my mind. I came to the conclusion that I tended to go off half-cocked. I needed to think of a thing, put it away, then think of it again before acting. Being alone, I had to act efficiently to survive as I was already in a precarious position, having to protect myself, harvest, and preserve for the winter, which I hadn't even begun doing. Create winter clothing and shoes, find a source of grain, create the baskets in which to store whatever I collected. I was not in any sort of a manifest destiny position or culture. Perhaps others would attempt to foolishly continue that behavior, and those I would have to beware of. The mother wanted me to nurture that which was around me. I would have to think on how this affected hunting and animal husbandry. I knew enough to harvest vegetables, roots and tubers in strips rather than to strip out an entire crop, and to fertilize as I went, as I could so that the plants could more easily regenerate. The axe would allow me to harvest firewood in a much more efficient manner, giving me more time for other demands. I made my first storage basket that day. It was 1/2 meter across and 3/4 of a meter tall. I was amazed at how my fingers flew, weaving the slats in and out of the ribs. I filled it full of salt and left it in the sand cave. That night, I retrieved the moss from the bear grease where I had it soaking, split it into 2 clumps, twisted them into rough tubes, and wrapped them in cattail leaf fiber. I buried all but the end of each wick into the grease in each lamp, then lit one. It was amazingly bright compared to the firelight. I fashioned a second harvesting bag with a carrying strap, then used the axe to fashion a rough shoulder yoke. I used a rock to smooth the surface of the wood and fashioned hooks at the ends of the yoke to keep the bags from slipping off. When I tried it on, my hands naturally fell to each bag, stabilizing them as I walked across the cave. I told myself work smart, not hard. I smiled after I figured out how to put out the grease lamp. You dunk it under the surface of the liquid grease, then pull it back up for relighting. I said my prayers and thanks, then went to sleep. Day 7. I awoke thinking about the benefits and construction of an ATL. It beat a throwing spear to flinders as far as range and killing power. It was a 2-part system, using a throwing stick and a large slender dart, tipped with a penetrating head. I realized that the slender hardwood shafts in the overpopulated valley would work quite well. I need to take some game so that I could cut veins from the hides and boil them in fat to stiffen them. The 6-foot-long flights required the stabilization of veins, much as arrows did. They also required stone or metal points to make them front-heavy. First, however, I needed the chert to flake in order to make the points. I planned out a trip to the chalk cliff. I wanted to take the axe, some canvas, some cordage, and 2 poles so that I could fashion a travois to haul the heavy stone back home. I carried a foraging bag as well in case I made a lucky find. The spears weren't quite ready yet. I always carried my knife. I emptied out the stew kettle and cleaned it out. The bear meat was nearly gone and was getting suspect in quality. I threw it away and spread out the fire coals to cool and burn out just before I left. It was a morning's walk to find the cliff. I found the flint nodules just as foretold. I quickly loaded up some 60 pounds worth on a hastily constructed travois and headed for home. Just as I came to the far side of the swamp, I noticed that I was being paced by a wolf. It must have been curious as it wasn't stalking me, just pacing me. Once I reached the cave, I dragged everything inside, started a fire, and boiled a few small potatoes for dinner. I missed a spoon to eat with. I supposed that I'd have to set aside a bit of time to figure out how to do it. I hadn't spotted any gourds that would substitute. I thanked the lady for a wonderful day and went to sleep. Week 2. I took some rabbits and a doe deer. The tree that had taken out the bear was a hickory. I found a likely fork and cut it free, then carved it into a throwing stick. I cut several flights for the ATL, and once peeled hung them in the fire pit's smoke to cure. I spent several days learning how to knap flint into usable scrapers, points, and blades. I knew that I'd get better. I had to get better. Each evening I wove another storage basket. Once I'd moved all the salt to the sand cave, I filled that shelf with empty baskets. I had finished processing all the bear grease. The tissue left after rendering out the grease was thrown out for the animals to feed on. Atop the cliff that housed me was a long, sloping field of grasses with big, fat kernels. I had my grain. I spent the last several days of the week climbing the cliff with a foraging bag and a piece of canvas, rubbing the kernels between my hands to catch the grain, tossing it a bit to glean out the chaff, and pouring it into the foraging bag. A 3-foot by 3-foot bag turns into a short bushel. I tried a grain porridge with a little salt. It really needed some grinding as the centers of the kernels didn't soften. I knew of 2 ways to grind grain. You could pound it like the Native American Indians did in a hollowed-out tree section, or scrape it like the Mexicans did in a metate. I kept my eye out for a long, smooth piece of granite with a central dishing. Each night, I prayed to the lady in thanks for showing me a better way to live. Week 3. There was a lot of grain to harvest, yet I couldn't do it to the neglect of everything else. I completed the ATL and hunted early each morning. If I got anything, it was cut up, hung, and smoking by noon. The smell of the smoke must have driven off the predators. The dried, smoked meat began accumulating. I had smoke-dried it until it was almost brittle to reduce the chance that mold would destroy it. Each afternoon, I gleaned grain. Each evening, I wove and filled a basket full of grain. I cleaned out the excess growth from that valley, constructing A-frames and hanging horizontal bars covered in preserved meat across, then filling the rear of the cave. I spent one day harvesting chalk from the cliff. I began baking it into quicklime, one small batch at a time. I prayed one night to Mother, I shall have no problem staying fed throughout the winter. Are there any nearby that will have a problem? I felt a great warmth, then fell asleep. When I awoke, another sleeping shelf was carved into the cave wall, far enough from the skylight to stay dry, yet close enough to the fire pit to gain some warmth. It was quite deep. Week 4. The grain was so ripe that it almost fell from the heads as I gleaned it. I was working the field all day and bringing in 2 or 3 bags of grain each day. The distance I had to walk back to the cliff's edge each evening was getting further and further. I was running out of places to keep the grain baskets, which pretty well told me that I'd overdone it. I was cutting up a dead tree a day, piling up the branches for nesting spots or mangers. The wood was piled up in face cords on the sand beach of the storage cave. I'd finally collected enough reeds and sticks to make my Cherokee backrest. I spent a day weaving the wands into one solid mass. When I was finished, I used 2 4-inch wide strips from my dark-dyed poncho to sew over the ends of the sticks. I used it to sit on not only in the cave, but in front while napping Flint. It may sound like a desperately hard life to you, but I found myself smiling at odd times, blessing the lady for her wisdom and her trust in me. I noticed that a certain dark grass was almost oily when cooked. I boiled several handfuls of the kernels and collected the oil that floated to the top. Upon combining that oil with unslaked lime, I had whitewash. Each evening, I painted a small part of the cave, especially the rock walls behind the grease lamps. It brightened up the cave quite a bit. While out hunting for more game, I heard a scream. I dropped the travois and loped in the direction of the cry. I soon came upon a bear, a rather large black bear that was on its hind legs in a dominance dance. I took up my throwing stick and a shaft, then went down to my knee as I finished my lunge. The shaft caught the bear under the chin and came out the back of the neck. He fell like a tree. Just in front of where he fell, I found a woman wrapped around a child, vainly trying to protect her little girl from the bear. They were both shivering, not expecting to live to their next breath. They were dressed in greasy, dirty, half-tanned animal skins. I got them up and looking at me, then pointed at the dead bear. They both latched onto me like there was no tomorrow. I suppose that for them that had been the absolute truth. I knelt down, taking them with me, and prayed my thanks to Mother. A great warmth came over me as if I were being held. Obviously the others felt it as well. The woman fell to the ground, clutching my legs while the little girl grinned and hugged my neck. I tapped them both on their shoulders. We have much work to do. The bear has given us a great gift in its body. Let us not waste it. They startled and rose with me. I jogged back to get my travois and returned. There wasn't any running water close, so I stripped before I began the butchery. I had the skin off the bear within 15 minutes, then used the axe to dismember it. We had the fat, the hams, the tenderloins, the paws, the kidneys, the liver, and the tongue butchered out in about 3 hours. We wrapped it in the skin and dragged it back to the cave on the travois. The woman and her daughter were frozen in place when I lit the grease lamp from the fire. Where are the others? Many must have labored to gather so much grain, hunt, and smoke so much meat. And the wood. There is enough here to last the spring and more. How many mates do you have? I smiled at them. 2 now. I pointed at them. You and you. She hugged me so hard I thought she was about to turn inside out. We will live. We will live through the winter. We will live. I nodded. Yep. I need you and you need me. I take you as my mate and your daughter as my daughter. I hugged them both. I looked down at the kid that was attached to my thigh like a limpet. What is your name, daughter? She grinned at me. Song. That's a pretty name, Song. What's your mommy's name? She spouted back, Mommy is called Lily. I turned my head. Well, Mommy Lily, let me show you what you've married into. Then we've got to get that bear meat on the smoke to cure it. All right. She buried her face in my chest. Nothing could be better. I took up a torch and lit it in the fire. I led the way into the storage cave. She gasped and almost fainted when she realized that we had over 300 pounds of salt stashed away. Gritty, dirty salt, but salt nonetheless. She couldn't count that well, but appreciated the amount of dried meat on the racks and the vast volume of grain in storage. I'd pounded out a lot of firewood the last 2 weeks, and it showed. I intended on doubling it until the fall rain stopped me. My prayers to Mother were heartfelt and joyous. Week 5. I turned to Lily and took her shoulders in my hands. I need you to find root vegetables like orange root and potatoes between now and the frost. We will need them to stay healthy and not lose our teeth. I do not know where to find such things, but you no doubt do. She was madly nodding her head and grinning. I will come with you to guard. Song will stay here to tend the fire, and we will gather for a while, because we must. I taught them how to make a stew in my little iron pot. I let them know why never to let it get too low on water. I started a bear tongue and potato stew while they watched. She knew where to find peppers, something like bay leaf, wild garlic, wild onions, and dillweed. The flavor of our stews took a dramatic step towards the better. A little ground grain added to provide body helped out a lot. Yes, there were wild carrots. A lot of them. There were a lot more wild potatoes as well. I was the beast of burden as we harvested. They lasted wonderfully while buried in the cold sand beach. The apples and pears were tiny yet flavorful. We harvested one hell of a lot of blackberries once the competitors, bears, had been wiped out. We had 7 bearskins to tan. I had one hell of a lot of rendered bear fat to store. Without that bee's nest, we never would have been able to store the rendered lard. Once I soaked a few baskets in bees' wax, they stored the fat wonderfully. Week 6. While exploring along the base of the cliff for more caves, I came upon a low, wide entrance. I tied a cord to my waist and to a tree at the entrance, lit a torch with my fire kit, and started in with my axe in hand. It soon sloped down to the point that without the cord I never could have escaped from the cave. It dropped over 10 meters, and I found myself sitting on a pile of litter. To one side I saw in the light of my torch a sow. She was barely breathing. I wondered how long she had been trapped in this cave without food or water. I prayed desperately hard. Mother, one of yours needs your help lest she die in innocence. Wham! I felt her attention on me like a tornado landing on a barn. Like the barn, I wondered at my chances of outliving the experience. A spring erupted from the floor of the cave. I used my foraging bag to transport water from the spring to the sow. She slowly began to drink. Soon she was in pain from drinking too much, too fast. I comforted her as I could, wrapping her within my arms. She could have savaged me with her tusks, yet she didn't. I had a bit of grain and some potatoes with me. She slowly ate them and drank some more. We fell asleep together. Upon awakening, I found her watching me. It was still dark. She nudged me with her snout. I wrapped my arm around her, and we fell back to sleep. Come the morning, I discovered that the lady had done something unusual. A gradual grade led to the surface. I led her up to the surface. She leaned into my leg and grunted several times. I scrubbed her ears and said, "You're welcome. Come back and visit sometime." She trotted off into the woods to make up for lost time. Winter was coming, and she needed to bulk up to survive. I prayed to the lady to help the sow. When I got back to the cave, Lily acted strange. "You have changed. Your hair is all white. You are taller. What happened?" I didn't really have an answer. I was blessed by the mother. She nodded. That was enough for her. Week 7. We got a good start on getting the bear skins tanned. They were scraped down, streaked and greased with rendered bear fat. We spent a lot of time during the rains stretching the skins and working in the fat. I looked around the cave and counted the bearskins. Mother, where are the rest of them? I got this funny blush like someone was laughing at my expense. I wondered when you would twig to it. Soon, before the frosts, more will come. I went out in the rains and harvested more deer. I even shot a bison. It took 4 trips to bring the carcass back to the cave. It was a good thing that I'd shot it. They followed the smoke from our smokehouse back to the cave. They had burned their village to the ground after living through a cholera epidemic. People kept getting sick until they burned the place down and left. Then they began to thrive. Regrettably, they were skin and bones. They were death waiting to happen. We took them in. There were only 6 left out of 44. They were quite happy to join us in what appeared to them to be God's warehouse. Food, firewood, meat, and water. What more could anyone want? Week 8. Sam, One of the new ones was jealous of my wife and daughter. He found a large rock and one night captured my arms next to my body with his thighs, then raised the rock to bash in my brain. I awoke and did the only thing that I knew to do. Mother, I have need. Must I die now? Sam just evaporated. When the others woke and were told what happened, they were terrified that their bright futures were to be ripped from their hands. I did my best to calm them, despite Lily's and Song's best efforts to convince me to turn them out in the winter storms. I was distraught. No, I was past that. I was depressed to the point of despondency. Mother, have I done enough? Is there another place for me? I no longer wish to live in a place where others attempt to kill me for my faith. If you have any grace at all, take me from here. If I awaken again, let it be up to you. Please, Mother, show me mercy. I fell asleep, not knowing if I would awaken again or not. I woke as a tall brown youth. I must have been fairly young as I had no wrinkles upon the backs of my hands. I was lying on a stone shelf inside a structure made of stone blocks larger than I could ever move by hand. I slowly sat up and wondered at what lay about me. Upon a stone table lay a long linen cloth that I knew was fashioned as a garment to cover my hips and crutch. A sleeveless jacket went over that, and a long jacket of steel scales that would stretch to my knees once worn. A circlet with an amber finial looked like a crown. I refused to wear it. I found a 6-foot hardwood staff with a bronze blade leaning against the wall. The end was capped with an iron point. A traveling bag lay near the door. Within it was a short steel knife, a few steel arrowheads the length of my hand in an oiled leather sheath, a carved wood box with a sliding lid which held split feathers, a 1/4 pound of beeswax wrapped in a cloth, a spear thrower, a hank of heavy strong cord the width of my smallest finger, a large spool of thinner waxed cord, a spool of nickel brass cable cut into 10-foot-long sections, a copper cup, a spoon, a water gourd, a bag of salt, a fire-making box, a cooking pot with a lid that would hold both of my hands locked together, and a canvas sheet large enough to form a shelter tied under it. I knew that the mother demanded that I use my mind. I took what I could of the room and strode out, wondering what would come to me. I looked back to see a decrepit temple covered in vines, brush, and moss. I realized that none would be coming to greet me. I opened my senses to the environment. I knew that many small animals were close. I fashioned 4 snares and placed them, then gathered firewood and retreated back into the tomb. It was dry there, and the afternoon promised rain. I shook my water gourd to see how full it was. Not very. I went back outside to clear the debris leading to 2 depressions at either side of the doorway. They appeared to have been used to hold small fires once before. I hoped that they would collect rainwater. 2 of my snares caught rabbits. I reset the snares, then quickly cleaned the rabbits and promptly had them on spits. It didn't take long to get a fire going. One corner of the temple appeared to have been designed for a fire pit. The smoke crept up the wall to disappear above. After disposing of the remains of my meal, I stoked the fire, then carefully examined the interior of the temple. I had heard of many older temples that lived in debated lands hid the temple treasury behind cunningly crafted stone doors. I pressed on the sides, tops, and bottoms of all the stones that I could reach with no success. Then, I thought about where my current gifts were left me, either on the altar or next to the doorway. I examined the altar more carefully. In the near dark, my fingertips came across a small slot in the stone at the head of the altar, if I were lying down on it. I sat back, while listening to the rain come down, and took another inventory of my pack. I ceased to frown and dug down into the bag for a spearhead. I used it to probe the slot. I found a socket within. Pressing did no good. Sliding the spearhead sideways, however, freed something deep within the stones. I thought about how a door might be built and latched. I used my palms to push and pull stones to one side. One stone to the side slid to the front and stopped. It did nothing else. Now what? It worked once, so I tried again. I moved the spearhead about in the slot. This time it sank in the length of 3 fingers wide, and I heard a click. I pushed, pulled, prodded, and twisted everything that I could think of. In disgust, I leaned against the altar. It smoothly slid to one side. I looked up to the ceiling hidden above in the shadows. Thank you, Mother, for keeping me humble. I may live longer this way. I peered down into the gloom, considering a foray below. I was not prepared. I closed up the altar because it looked wrong as it sat. I then filled my gourd from the water streaming down the side of the temple and drank my fill. Afterwards, I went out to check and gather my snares. I had 4 snares full of little piggies, and a huge snake had swallowed one of them and left itself caught like a fish on a hook. I took its head off with my sword staff, then gutted and skinned it there in the forest. That was all the meat that I would need, so I stowed my snares. I cut many long, springy grass-like stalks up to the size of my thumb. I took everything back to the temple where I assembled a drying rack above the fire pit. I hung the meat and started a small fire burning with the wood that I had gathered. Then I went out to find more in the jungle. I looked for dead hanging branches and plates of tree bark. I found enough to keep the fire burning a night and a day. Soon I had some pig for dinner. Afterwards, I cleaned up and drank from the dishes of water near the temple door to preserve my water supply. I spent a while making a carry sack from the pig skins for the dried meat. When I became tired, I thanked the mother and slept. I awoke during the night to turn the meat and rebuild the fire. I made water outside the temple, drank my fill, and slept once again. I dreamed about the crown. It glowed. So that was its purpose. The next morning I rose to greet the day. A vexing problem had solved itself during the night, which was a good sign. I no longer had to worry about keeping a lamp, candle, or torch lit while underground. The meat was not ready yet, so I spent the day collecting more firewood, tanning pigskins, and in contemplation. On the third morning I woke and checked the meat. It was ready. I did my morning ritual, then broke my fast. A bit of water was still in the temple dishes, which I carefully sucked out. I then packed away all the dried meat and scattered the evidence of my presence into the jungle. I fashioned a way to hang my spear over my shoulder, took up my possessions including the helm, opened the altar, and peered below. I caught sight of hand and foot holes in the shaft. I swung myself into the hole and started down. After an arm's length, I reached up to pull the altar stone back into position. As I climbed down, I took care to not scratch or score the walls any more than I had to, but occasionally my sword staff struck against the wall. Above me, in the abandoned temple, the serpents came out from their hiding places. Their nests were within the temple walls. My arms were getting hot and tired when I found the staff caught in a side passage. I gratefully sat in the opening where I had a drink of water. I did not know it, but I had just avoided an insidious trap. From there on the side, bearing hand and foot holds slowly swung back from vertical until the unlucky climber would be thrown down into the crevice below. The priests had counted to 144. I relied on luck. I had to crawl some distance, feeling my way ahead, until the amber-colored gem between and above my eyes started to glow. It slowly got brighter, showing me a path splitting left and right. I used my hands to feel the floor. It was smoother to the left, so I went left. The ceiling above me raised until I could walk upright. Soon I came to what must have been an underground monastery. I found a kitchen, a bathhouse, several sleeping chambers, classrooms, and a temple. I genuflected in the temple, thanking for my guesting from whoever or whatever still resided in that long-abandoned place. Courtesy cost me nothing. I cast up a prayer of thanks and encouragement to those who caused the place to be built. I spent a night there, bathing in the cold water coming in from the mountains many miles away through hidden underground ways. I was surrounded by an amber glow given off by the crown. Beyond that light, the blackness weighed heavily upon me. Why was I there? What was I to learn? Where was I to go? I used the maze secret to find any hidden rooms. I laid my left hand upon a wall and started walking, never taking my hand from the wall. This brought me into a cleaning closet near the kitchen. At the rear of it was a disguised handle in the rear wall. When pulled, the wall opened into a hallway. With all my gear on my back and a full canteen, I hesitantly walked into the passageway. I slowly walked down the passageway, watching for any changes. I had an odd sensation that my eyes were being fooled. I undid my breeks and peed in the middle of the passageway. The liquid quickly ran further down the hall ahead of me. No, it was not flat and level as I had assumed. I backed up until I reached the doorway. I did not trust this passage any further. I pulled the door closed and continued my search. I found nothing else until I came to the shower room. There I found a slot in the stone below the lever which freed water to pour down. This made sense. A brother should be cleansed before entering the temple, and where else to do it but where water flowed. I covered my pack then, feeling foolish, pulled the lever to start the water. I then used a spearhead to probe the slot. The bottom pushed in about 2 fingers width, then stopped. I stopped the water flow and pushed in again. The bottom pushed in 3 more fingers depth, and a side wall sagged open. I pushed it down until it clicked, then stepped over the lintel into the room beyond. A rod sticking out of the wall moved to free the wall's catch, and a handle built into the wall allowed me to lift it back into place where it clicked home. The large room behind me was well lit by some sort of windows high in the wall. At one end of the vaulted room was an altar facing several pews. Behind the altar stone was a stucco display of a vine-wrapped tree surrounded by woods. 2 ghostly eyes looked out from high in the tree's canopy. It appeared to be colored with crushed glass as the entire display glistened in the light. The other end was filled with small box-like openings in the wall, each one holding a rolled-up scroll. I curiously approached and withdrew a scroll at random. I gingerly spread it out at one of the tables. I was surprised to find that I could read it. It was an instructional volume on how to build a bridge across a gorge or other void, including how to prepare the footings below and at either approach. I found it quite interesting and soon finished it. I replaced the treatise, then stepped back to count the number of cells. There were 8 groups of 10 cells across the bottom, and they rose some 14 cells high. If all of them were filled, then there were over 1,000 volumes represented. It was a magnificent library. I explored the rest of the room and found a passage leading to a toilet and several dormitory rooms followed by doorway leading outside. I saw a broad valley with rough rock walls, continuing on until I lost the details in the distant mist. Along one side of the valley ran a stream that I barely heard as it was a short distance away. There was a profusion of plants growing near the temple, stopping only at the edge of the stone platform surrounding the rear of the building. It appeared as if someone's garden had run wild for a long, long time. In the distance, I saw the waving of tall grasses dancing in the breeze. I walked towards it until I could identify what was growing. If it wasn't wheat, then it was a pretty amazing replica. I stripped a head and chafed it in my hands until the kernels separated from the hulls, then chewed a few. Yep, starchy and sweet. It was still green though. I cut across the edge of the field and approached the stream. Slowly the sound of the water grew louder. It was a broad, shallow river with some exposed rock sticking up through the surface. I looked back towards the temple and found it hard to pick out against the mountain that it was dug from. I was in a wide rift. The river must have carried sand and dirt into the valley floor to provide dirt for growing things. No doubt there were animals in the valley that fed from the bounty. I would have to find some runs and set up a small trap line. As I walked the shore of the river, I found the place where it emptied into a break in the rocks. It was partially blocked, and the water had backed up into a small wet valley that had turned into a swamp as the water had slowed down and spread out. It had dropped any load of soil that it had been carrying, providing a fertile muck to support the wetland's growth. I saw many plants that I was unfamiliar with. However, I did spot a large growth of cattails. I stripped down, took my knife, and got down and dirty cutting strips of the long reeds out of the muck. I'd need several armfuls to make a bed. I'd also need plenty to weave gleaning baskets and storage baskets for food. I could see being here a while. If I was supposed to use my mind, then I assumed that I was to read as much of the library as I could. I wondered what I was to use for fuel to cook. Perhaps the answer was under my nose. So far I'd been lucky enough to stumble across what I needed. I went back to the patio to spread out my cattails to dry, then went back inside to explore the building with more care. I did finally find another passageway leading to what I would call the support services rooms. I found a slot opening at the end of the library shelves closest to the outer wall. That led to a passageway which led to the kitchen, larder, and laundry. The larder was empty, which I expected, and the laundry was equally barren. Shallow stone tubs lined the walls, and a large stone table dominated the floor. The kitchen featured broad tables, and against the walls were plinths topped by shallow pans filled with some sort of spongy, translucent, fibrous mineral. In one corner sat a huge stone vat with a lid covering it. I shifted the lid to find the vat mostly full of some sort of oil. It didn't smell like anything, but that characteristic, heavy smell. I looked about further and found some small bowls. I didn't need anything so large to cook over as the big pans, but a small bowl bearing some oil and half filled with the mineral as a wick would make a grand cooker. If I wanted to use the grill that would lower over one of the pans, I could nestle my smaller heat source in the existing mineral to keep it stable and position it where the heat would do the most good. I considered it a perfectly adapted solution. Before dark, I went back out to lay my snares, ate a bit of dried meat, and scavenged a while in the rampant garden. Before it got dark, I fashioned a fascine to sleep on out of the cattails and secured my canvas to lay both on and under. I gave thanks to the mother for my gifts that day, not the least being my life, which I almost lost in the trapped passageway. It had been an eventful day. The next morning I used the latrine, ate some fresh vegetables to keep my belly happy, and went out to check my traps. I had caught a rabbit which I quickly cleaned and, after resetting my snare, took back to the kitchen to grill. After eating, I scrupulously cleaned my hands before going back to the scrolls. In this fashion of working each morning and studying each afternoon, I spent many months at the monastery. When the grain came ripe, I cut it short and bound it into sheaves which I took back to the kitchen. There were many large containers there, which eventually held quite a bit of grain. I found an adequate grinding stone which had split off the cliffside long before to use as metate base. To clean up the detritus from my gleaning and grinding the grain, I fashioned a broom out of my sword staff and wheat straw. As the weather got colder, I learned to fashion a brazier out of a broad-bottomed bowl that I punched 2 holes near the lip and tied a piece of my snare cable between them to use as a handle. I kept it under the table as I studied and in the smaller sleeping room that I found. My daylight hours became shorter and shorter, but I had less tasks to do since the garden was dormant and the animals either dead or hibernating. I fashioned shoes of woven grass to cover my feet and a cape to cover myself with. I had made a hat from several layers of rabbit skin that must have looked like some horrible monster was trying to suck my brains out, but it served its purpose. I learned much of medicine, chemistry, mathematics, engineering, geology, mineralogy, mining, shipbuilding, stone construction techniques, tool design, and the principles of constructing furnaces and alloying metals. By spring, I was pretty well studied out. While the mud dried in the fields, I wove a coolie hat, a pair of hanging baskets, and a shoulder yoke. I filled one basket with a rabbit skin bag containing wheat, and the other with a stoppered flask full of oil, a cooker the size of my cupped hand, and my other possessions from the pack. My feather box held carefully hoarded slips of paper, holding seeds for a garden. When the ground was dry, I stripped all sign of my presence from the temple and started up the valley. Within 2 days, I reached the head end where the river deepened a bit and the shorelines became rock walls. A half-day's travel brought me to a slight broadening of the shore at the bottom of a waterfall, perhaps 6 times my height. I stood back with my hands on my hips, evaluating a climber's path up to the top. I tied a line about my gear and fastened the other end to my belt, then made my way cautiously up the spray-slickened rocks. I gently but firmly grasped with my fingers and toes, taking my time so as not to become out of breath and reduce my judgment. The top lip soon fell to my grasp, and I rolled over the edge. Peering down over the cliff, I lifted my burden up the side hand over hand, carefully keeping it away from any snagging rocks. When I had my bags in hand, I crawled away from the edge, stood, and turned to take in my first view of this upper plateau. I smiled. Trees. Wonderful trees. Great soaring things with dense tops that kept the understory sparse except in and near clearings. I emptied my canteen and refilled it with the aerated water at the foot of a small rapids and strode out, watching for usable or edible plants as I made my way through the woods, my senses open and alert to what was around me. I came onto a patch of thin wood shoots, some of which were the width of my first finger. I carefully cut a half-dozen of them and topped them at 6 feet. They were very tough. I barked them and tied them together, and then to my shoulder yoke. I would work on my flights later after I made camp and during the days ahead. I came upon an elevated stony clearing that had several large sheets of quartz thrust up at an angle, forming a protected spot. I carefully searched for scorch marks as some stony outcrops were known to be lightning sinks and the clouds were closing in over my head. I thought it worth the risk and stacked the larger, yet movable rocks laying about into a shelter with the quartz rocks making a partial roof overhead. I propped up several large flat stones to serve as a reflector opposite the quartz so I would be warmed from 2 sides. I then went out with my axe to seek dry firewood. I dragged back 4 deadfalls that were roughly the diameter of my thigh at their bottoms. Before dark, I had them cut into sections thanks to a very sharp axe. I stacked the dry wood in the crevice between the quartz and the ground to keep it dry. I then sat before the fire, carefully re-sharpening my axe with a bit of found stone while the wind blew up and the cold rain pelted my shelter. I relaxed, swaddled in my long grass cloak. I once more thanked the mother for the gifts which I had been shown that day. In my sleep, I was shown a different view of my shelter. It was an old place. The forest loam had grown to cover it over the many years. The trees had taken down and overgrown the watchtowers. There was nothing evil about the place, nor inherently good. It was simply old and abandoned. I had a bit of a project ahead of me. But first, food. I found a few small animal runs and placed my snares, then carefully searched out the underbrush for edible plants. I was happy to find some of the last season's crop of ground tubers waiting for me, and I found a large depression full of curled-up ferns just burst from the ground. I collected a double handful of them for greens, then went searching with my nose. I found some wild garlic. Now, if my snares caught any meat, I would be in good shape. Later that afternoon, I revisited my snares. Of the 6 I had employed, 4 had borne fruit. I had 3 rabbits and a big porcupine that I dispatched with my sword staff. I gathered up all my snares because I wouldn't need any meat for a couple of days. My cooking pot came out, and I half filled it with water from a forest pool. Then I put together a stew to simmer away while I started work clearing my new home. I recalled from my dream the size of the building. I cut and peeled 4 saplings to serve as corner markers that I thrust into the ground where I thought appropriate. Then I started in with my shovel clearing the area. It was only 3 hands deep and mostly leaf mold. It would make excellent garden soil. I found a direction that had no old-growth trees on a space sufficient for a small field, and it was there that I cut down the trees and deposited the soil. It took almost a month to expose the fitted stone floor and the fallen wall stones. I planted my garden and laid several passes of snares to not only feed me, but to reduce the number of opportunistic little buggers that would eat anything that I planted with great delight, except for maybe the peppers and garlic. I transplanted many other forest plants to my garden as well, such as ground tubers and the wild garlic. I trekked over a wide area to not only gain familiarity with the area, but to find more plants for my attempts at husbandry. I also succeeded in finding a stream within walking distance of my hopefully new home. With a long summer ahead of me, I carefully dry-laid the dressed stone blocks. I had no mason's chisels nor gritty string to cut or shape the stones, so I took great care in how I laid them. I could think of but one way to roof over the place. It was built in one large room some 40 feet on a side, 12 feet tall. There were 4 window holes in the walls and 1 narrow doorway. I removed 4 stones from 10 feet in from each end and sank 2 king posts some 4 feet down and 20 feet tall. The tops were hewn in an X fashion, and I took my life in my hands climbing them to place a cross member on top of them with its ends fashioned so that it would fit into 1/4 of the X atop the verticals. Then saplings were close laid on either side of the cross member and lashed down with strong rope made from grasses. The next members were much shorter and tied across the end poles so that they were a foot below the ridge. I carefully used my hand axe to notch the outsides of the king poles and the outsides of the horizontals and fashioned a brace for each end. I had to use more grass rope to bind the braces to the king poles. Next, more saplings were laid from the tops of the walls to the shorter cross members. Then everything was covered in sheaves of grass. At the top of each row, a split sapling was laid to hold them down in bad weather. The saplings were tied down at the ends. I fashioned a long grass mat to cover the top ridge that was held in place by another 2 split saplings. The holes on either end were left open for smoke. 2 months it took me, and at the end of it I stood back and shook my head. I said to myself, the first good storm that comes up will carry the damn thing halfway to Kansas. Sure, if I had a team of 6 people and the tools, I could have built a mortise and tenon frame, then laid on a slate or stone roof. But I didn't have either the manpower or the resources, so we went back to the Dark Ages or Ireland. Take your pick. As the weather spun down towards winter, I spun and wove many grass mats from the local wheat straw. Soon I had enough to pad the inner walls of the redoubt. I made a fire pit of clay and rock, backed by slabs of rock to reflect the heat onto my front, while the quartz wall reflected the head onto my back. I had many baskets of grain stacked against the far wall and thin wood wands hung from the rafters with preserved meat draped over them to stay dry. Many arms full of vegetables were also hung from the ceiling, preserved and dry. Seed from the best grain and the best vegetables were carefully put aside for the next year. I hunted every day that it did not rain. On the wet days, I went out to harvest firewood. Half the building was filled with cut firewood some 10 feet high, and 2 outer walls were covered in tall cords of wood. I fashioned a crude chimney and cone-shaped cowl over the fire from woven grass to collect and guide the smoke out the ceiling draft hole. I was rudderless, adrift. I had simply followed my nose and built this place. I prayed to the mother to find my purpose in her world. I soon dreamed of a trap door opening from within my rude shelter that opened onto a worn stairway leading down and down towards the roots of the mountains. The stairway led so deep into the earth that the temperature rose, and the great stones protecting the vault below groaned and strained under their load. The next scene showed me sitting at a table with an amulet about my neck, studying a scroll with the chest lying open on the floor beside me. The third and last scene showed me standing outside calmly, taking in the flames dancing above my upturned right hand. I woke lying on my back, looking up at the quartz glowing in the morning light. Magic. I am to learn magic. To think that I could learn magic. What a magical thing. I giggled to myself at the absurdity of it all. However, if the mother had such confidence in me, then I could scarcely let her down. I sat up and saw the chest from my dream resting beside the fire pit. Well, there was nothing for it but to try. Now was there? Much to my relief, the chest opened easily to my touch. It was perhaps a 3-foot by 4-foot chest some 4 feet tall with a domed lid, which held several panels with simple closures. The bulk of the chest held rank on rank of heavy scrolls. I gazed down at the chest's contents and felt severely disquieted. There was a trap here somewhere, and I had no idea how to confound it, much less how to find it. I closed the chest for the moment and concentrated on the other features that I had observed in my dream. I sacrificed one of my precious steel flight heads to make a drill bit by gently hammering the edges around a strong stick, in essence curling the spear head's edges to shave away wood as it bit. Next, I fashioned a bow drill and fastened that modified spearhead to it. When I was finished, it would drill out a 3/4-inch hole. Next, I found an old fallen pine tree some 4 feet around and cut a segment free from the trunk roughly 7 feet long. I had split out some large hardwood wedges before while working on the roof beams. I used these to begin splitting the log into large flat sections. Once I had riven the huge board free of the trunk, I began the laborious process of smoothing it. I began by loading it with rocks and dragging it over the rough ground back to the cabin. My hand axe helped with the worst of the job, but the final smoothing fell to the use of a stone sliding back and forth over the surface until it was a toss-up whether I wanted it smoother or I had any strength to spare in my arms and back. Another session with the axe and wedges broke out a slab sufficient to make 2 wide benches. I cut hardwood saplings to fashion trestles for the chair and table bottoms, which I drilled and pegged together. To make backs for the benches, I drilled holes in the thick seats at an angle, then drilled matching holes in the edge of the back pieces. Heavy carved pegs connected the 2 sections on both benches. I found that they made wonderful sleeping benches. Once I covered them in deerskin so that I didn't get splinters in my ass. Once more I opened the chest. I believed that I had intuited the trap. The dream had explicitly shown me wearing a necklace while working with the volumes. I gingerly opened the first panel within the dome top, showed me a lamp. I only recognized it as a lamp because of my 20th century memories. It had a broad, heavy base, a shaft, and a multifaceted stretched-out crystal, some 8 inches long, supported vertically about 14 inches off the base. I grinned with a twitch of my lip and facetiously said, "Let there be light." Be damned if the thing didn't light up like a 100-watt bulb. I don't know why, but I said, "Thank you, friend." That set the tone for the rest of the afternoon. I pulled forth bowls, plates, tableware, cups, and a pitcher. I even found within that thing a 1-liter graduated Pyrex glass cylinder. In a small sliding drawer, I found the necklace that I had seen in my dreams, and for the life of me, what appeared to be a cross pen and pencil set. I settled the necklace about my shoulders and looked at the chest. Which one first? I decided to let the chest tell me. Which one of you should I pick first? The scroll in the upper right corner pulsed with a green glow and went out. Well, that was enough of a hint for me. I gently removed the scroll by lifting on the open sack supporting it. As I started to unroll it, the thing pushed my hands away and reformed as a thick book, some 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. It was perhaps 8 inches thick. Wow, now this was magic. I opened the book and began to read. Rule 1. The all is alive. Rule 2. The all is alive and watching everything you do. I reached over and patted my lamp. Thank you, friend, for helping me despite my ignorance. Rule 3. The all can be persuaded to transform, conjure, invoke, and empower. Rule 4. The effects generated will be directly proportional to the depth of concentration and quality of visualization of the invoker. Rule 5. Never anger a spirit agent because they never, ever forget. Rule 6. The all is a lot smarter than you are. The all is a lot smarter than anything you can conceive of. The all creates and destroys sons and gods regularly. Rule 7. You get what you ask for. The all is capricious, and any ill-conceived or open-ended spell will be fulfilled directly as requested, and may whatever God you believe in help your soul. Rule 8. The rule of 3 is always watching. Any act with malicious intent performed by an empowered one shall come back threefold on their sorry ass. Rule 9. There is always another way. Rule 10. Death resets all debts. Wow. Just wow. I had seen myself in my dream casting flame, so I was destined to become an empowered one. The mother had that in my future, and one did not naysay mother. In words from my original life, if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. I suppose that from then on it was practice, practice, practice. I had an audacious idea for a first attempt. I missed my old dreadnought. She was a Martin D, 28, and she had a little of my soul trapped in her sound box. I felt her in my arms. I tasted her finish. I smelled her finish and felt her strings beneath my fingers. I let out such a surge of mixed hope and despair that I cried out. That's when I felt her in my arms. I cried simple tears and gave my thanks. I played myself stupid with an ecstatic smile on my face. In response, I felt a feeling of satisfaction coming from the air around me. That night, I slept with my guitar in my arms. Mother, are you the all? I received a simple answer and a warm feeling before I fell asleep. Yes, dear. I woke up feeling wonderful. I did a little moonwalking, a little slide and shuffle, and a bit of blue scat stomp and spin. I regretfully had to put down my baby because my fingertips were starting to bleed. I called out, Mother, please heal me so that I may play more for you in joy. Flash. It felt as if I were hit by a lightning bolt. I fell to the ground, arching my back. When I caught my breath, I rose and took stock. Good Lord, I was 16 again. Well, that's what I got for not putting in my loop constraints. I picked up Rose, my guitar's name, and did a little Bach number. Mother had given me a bit of a gift. My dexterity was way up there. Speed riffing Bach is so cool. Hard winter was coming on. I thought deeply about this conjuration bit. I didn't want anything fancy, but I had need of some warm clothing. I remembered having a long, dark brown blanket shirt that went down to my butt when I was younger. I remembered how wonderful it felt with its tall collar and deep sleeves. I envisioned a longer, heavier version of the same thing that would reach the floor. I reached out and grasped it in my arms. I took a deep breath, smelling the thing in my arms, and gave a quiet, heartfelt thanks for the gift and reply to my request. Again, I felt a pulse, a glow of satisfaction in reply. I put it on and basked in its warmth, then gave thanks once again. I recalled finding glasses, bowls, and plates within the chest. Perhaps hunting was a thing of the past. I put out the cup, bowl, dish, and plate along with the tableware. I envisioned a turkey dinner, complete with cranberry relish, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, and blueberry pie. The air went hazy for a moment before me. Then a feast took shape on the table. I noted to the lamp, "I hope that you can enjoy this along with me. This is something special and should be shared." I dug in, balancing the richness of the meat and stuffing with the acidity of the cranberry compote. The rich, sweet blueberry pie finished off the treat. Afterwards, I commented to the lamp, "Now that was wonderful. Meals like that are to be treasured, like the smell of freshly baked bread, fresh cheese, and a well-grilled meal. I hope you have a way to appreciate such things." I got back a sensation of gray. I was horrified. What spiteful spirit would so tease you yet rob you of the sensations that you offer to others? I was incensed. "Mother, a travesty has been done in your name. Mother, I call upon you to right a wrong. Mother, in the name of judgment, I invoke you." Well, I stepped in it. The breeze stopped. The sun dimmed. The birds locked up in midair. I felt as if the entire world's eyes were upon me. "Speak, my priest." "Mother, the very spirits that I invoke have no ability to enjoy the pleasures that we take for granted. They cannot appreciate the touch of a warm garment, the taste and satisfaction gained by a wonderful meal, the basic response of a body's response to a warm summer's rays. What would you have me do? I'd just been given a lot of rope to hang myself with. How could I do this gracefully? Mother, I would have you copy my feelings and give the ability to appreciate your creation to all of your magical agents." The silence was deafening. I had no idea if I'd just stepped in an infinitely deep pile of shit or not. So be it. It felt like thousands of butterflies brushing against me. Sparkles left in all directions for hours. Finally, I fell asleep on my rude bench. I woke up wondering what my changes had wrought. I was but a single person and had no idea how such a profound change would affect the land. I asked my first friend in this land, my lamp, how I had done. "You have brought much astonishment and joy. Many old ones have retreated to evaluate what has been done to them and what they have done in light of this new appreciation of what is." I asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" I heard a response that was almost bashful. "Would you play your music for me again?" I smiled and began with a bright chord. "Let me bring you songs from the wood." Then I sang a song of unlimited power, Voodoo Child. After that, the lamp was terrified, then pensive. "You kind hosts so many spirits." That last song promised to crack the world just for wanting to see the world burn. I tried to explain. Each song has its own mood, its own power. Some songs are designed to heal. Listen to this. "As it was in the beginning, and it shall be in the end." I spent the afternoon experimenting in visualization. I asked for and received a bushel of perfect, white flaked salt. I gave my thanks and explained that it was used to preserve meat. Next, I visualized and created a large grass mat, then duplicated it several times. I then had carpets, wall coverings, and the materials to create a protected sleeping corner where no deep freeze could chill me. My lamp chided me and had me conjure a block of iron 7 feet long by 3 feet wide to place beneath my sleeping furs. I was taught how to command the iron to remain at 100 degrees until told otherwise. This was amazing. A sheet like that under my bottom on my chair as I studied, and one under my bedding would ensure my warmth and health throughout the winter. That evening, I conjured a meal of meaty, cheesy lasagna and shared it with the spirits far and wide. The next evening, it was simply garlic, butter, and spaghetti. The richness of the butter and bite of the garlic surprised the poor, sense-deprived spirits. I continued to read the scrolls. It helped me quite a bit to talk through my lessons with the spirit of the lamp. Often a different viewpoint hammered home a point or an idea. Thus I expanded upon my previous education. Considering the schooling that I had had on earth, the volumes which I had read in the temple, and what I was reading, then I may not have been the most educated mortal on the planet, but I was probably a contender for the title. I was worried about my roof taking flight in a storm. I conjured large sheets of copper which I hooked over and under the long runners, replacing the sheaves of grass. Then from my lessons in tool design, I summoned up punches, drills, bits, wood and stone chisels, saws, wood planes, and hammers. I took great care in conjuring up a forcing block to pound pegs through to get perfect cylinders with flutes that would hold glue and strengthen the pegs. I smoothed my table and chairs, then transmuted them to hard, dense maple. I conjured up a large stone tank to fill one corner as I had seen in the temple's kitchen, then conjured it full of cooking oil. I called into being a work table next to the stone tank with a small depression near the front for my cooker. My expedient woven grass fire hood was replaced by a riveted copper cone and flue that led out of the roof. My poor fire ring on the floor became a 2-foot diameter recessed stone fire pit, centered on a rectangular rock plinth 3 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet long. I carefully visualized and summoned into place a heavy maple door hung by heavy iron strap hinges in the doorway instead of the grass mats, which had been my only recourse before. My lessons progressed. I became worried that I would lose that sense of wonder and appreciation that the mother had first forced upon me and then allowed me to foster on my own. I'd never been able to draw or sculpt worth a damn. I cast an invocation over myself to increase my artistic abilities. I took a deep breath and picked up a stick with a charred end. I proceeded to draw a sparrow landing on a branch across the wall of quartz. I thought that it was wonderful. I called up a little steel graver and filled in the texture of the feathers and the features of the branch. Then I passed a hand over it to cut it slightly into the face of the quartz wall. From then on, the rising sun would illuminate the etching in the morning light. I slept on what I had done. The next morning I conjured fresh bread, butter, honey, and hot tea. I shared my sensations with my friend, then began the next step in my plan. I discussed the spell I was about to improvise with my friend. I spent much time crafting it because if I made a mistake, I would no longer be around to lament its failure. I cast a spell to strengthen and deepen my memory. When it was completed, I tottered off to my bed, quite out of it. When I woke, it was 2 days later. I was extremely thirsty, and my bladder was quite indignant about the circumstances. After voiding myself and wrapping myself around a quart or two of good cold water, I sat down at the table and cast my memory back to my time spent in the temple library. I recalled not only the words but the diagrams as well. I remembered further back to my youth. When I was sick or the weather was inclement, I spent many days across the street reading through the encyclopedia. Those pages came back to me as if the books were before me. This was marvelous. Now I supposed I had to give the process time to integrate all that information. I was ready for the final step in my project. I summoned forth a 4-foot by 4-foot silver alloy sheet that would not tarnish, a set of round-tipped gravers, and a small hammer. I recalled all the times that I had spoken with Mother. I brought forth the feelings she invoked in me. I remembered the one time I had actually seen her and the imagery from the temple wall. I let all this distill within me, then took up a graver and hammer. I began to work on my shrine. To the end, I never recalled what I sang, said, or chanted as I worked, but I know something came out of my mouth. By the end of the day, I felt that I had a good start on it. I laid the sheet aside, stretched, and made a small stew from my preserved meat and vegetables. Within an hour, it was ready. I ate my dinner, cleaned my bowl, and lay down to sleep. I gave my thanks to Mother before I allowed myself to slumber. I shared my joy in consuming a big, crisp Belgian waffle doused in sweet maple syrup and rich, salty butter, accompanied by a refreshing, tart glass of cold apple juice for breakfast. Then cleaned up and continued working on the altarpiece for my temple. Each time I paused, I recalled another facet of the Mother, then eagerly continued on. I called forth a soft copper tool which I used to mark the form, representing the green vessels I had seen beneath her skin. I carefully aged those marks to verdigris and sealed them in time, appearance, and place. I finished the piece by bringing forth 2 milky white almond-shaped opals to represent her eyes. I caused a raised dais to form in the northeast corner. The plaque was fastened in the corner to the rear. A bowl of sand came to be before her image, and a box of incense rods lay to one side. A simple candle sat nearby. I lit a stick and thrust it in the sand upright. Only then I sat back, took up my guitar, and called the Mother. I played until there was no more light, then said a final prayer of thanks and slept. I dreamed that I was a wandering monk, making my way across the lands, performing miracles under the guise of magic, and bringing to all that would listen the message of the Mother. When I woke, I had much to think on. First, I realized that I had to finish the scrolls before I would be prepared to leave. Second, every bit of evidence I had come across on this world pointed to a knowledge-loving culture that had fallen long ago, possibly leaving barbarians in its wake. I had to school myself in techniques both defensive and offensive. Third, I had to guard and preserve this place which I had built with my hands and had come to love. I would not leave it for others to carelessly despoil, or worse, learn a bit of the magic here and use it as a weapon against others. Educated savages were the most destructive. My first awakening in this place gave me a scale mail hauberk. I considered this both a portent and a warning. I set about reading the rest of the scrolls. I soon had them all committed to memory so that I could return to them over and over again to learn. The last scroll was empty. I was to take it with me as a journal. I reasoned that despite my mind's current ability to recall anything that I wished, it would not benefit the next generation. I began writing my history since I first came under the care of the Mother. I wrote of my experiences, my feelings, and my conclusions. My next task was to make myself formidable in defense and offense. I wondered if I could form a shield about myself and my obsessions. I imagined a cylinder about myself that would let nothing solid to pass inward. I walked forward with it about me and was halted by striking an overhead tree limb. Well, that part worked. I bent to pick up a stone which I threw at a tree. It struck the tree and was not blocked. I bespelled a river-washed piece of quartz shaped like a finger to hold that spell in a form that would wrap me in protection to 2 feet from my skin and anchor me in place. I shaped it to trigger whenever I was not awake and aware. In that fashion, it would protect me in my sleep as well. Next, I considered defense for mental skills. I designed and enacted a spell that would capture and bury within a near-endless maze any mind foolish enough to probe mine. I implemented it within a sphere of sandstone. Now for offense. If I were captured, then I would have nothing but my own body to aid me. I recalled the lines from an ancient holy book from India. His eyes cast forth rivers of light, such that all fell before him in despair and died. I was hesitant to even attempt this one. It sounded more than a bit draconian. However, I had to know if the power of Shiva could be cast by a mortal. I walked out into the woods where I searched out an old tree at the end of its lifespan. I found an old fruit tree that had been lightning split and was about to naturally expire. I focused on the still living base of the tree and called forth the power as the book had described. It lasted but a moment, yet I had blisters on my cheeks and my eyebrows were missing. There was nothing left of the tree save a hole in the ground shaped like the tree's root system. It had been blasted out of existence. Well, I had a nuclear weapon. Now I wanted a mortar, a rifle, and a pistol's equivalent. I could throw a pebble with my hand. Could I throw a pebble with my mind? Could I cause motion? What of a simple lifting? I cast a pebble on the table and sat contemplating it. I saw it in many ways. I came to understand that pebble. I saw it as multiple possibilities. Without a spell or a word either spoken or brought forth in my mind, the pebble rose into the air, stopped, spun about its axis, became vapor, and reformed into another pebble. Yes, I could do this thing. Even if someone mazed my mind so as to take my ability to think in words, I would be terrible in combat. All around me was a weapon. I had the ability to heat matter to a glowing charged gas or still its heat until it had none to give. Once more I went outside to experiment. I selected a stone and threw it high above the world until the air no longer kept it warm. I then caused it to gain heat as quickly as I could. A brilliant purple-white pinpoint flashed into existence and slowly faded high above me. That was a little experiment in overkill, now wasn't it? Perhaps a simple, fast dissociation into gas was a preferable technique. I selected another pebble which shot up into the air perhaps a mile away and a mile high. I jabbed at it forcefully to break it into a gas. I felt the pressure wave from the concussion, and the sound rivaled the loudest thunder that I had heard. Yep, that would do it. I thought that it was a pretty good day's experiments. I laid down to commune with the mother, asking if this was the direction that I was supposed to travel in. My answer was interesting. The direction I was supposed to travel in was whatever direction I took. I suppose that meant that I'd graduated the temple school and was now a priest. In the morning I had a meal of fried potatoes and sausage which my friend enjoyed as much as I did. I asked my friend if it wanted to join me in my wanderings. I received approval. I stretched out the lamp's shaft to a tall walnut staff and reformed the heavy base to a brass finial. I thought about how to guard my home. From my readings in mathematics and physics, I conceived of a space where the time dimension was rotated 90 degrees from that of ours. I then felt about for the tensor that transformed the spherical space, enclosing my home to that brain, and implemented it. I created a gray hooded linen long shirt to wear and a pair of harem pants tied at the waist. I created a small pectoral that repeated the image I had crafted into my altarpiece to wear around my neck. Next, I wondered how to go about. Walking seemed such a bore. I called into being a donkey shaped of black iron with a simple saddle and stirrups. Is there any spirit about that might want to animate an iron donkey for a while? The statue shook itself and snorted. The skin on its withers shook a bit as if to shake off a bothersome horsefly. It pawed the ground a bit, then turned its head to look at me. I clapped my hands. Very good for an extempore performance. Full marks. I heard in my mind, thank you. For my next act, the black iron donkey before me turned a gray-brown with black hair. It looked quite realistic. Good idea. Camouflage. Now, let's wait until either dawn or dusk and take a look from a few thousand feet up to get the lay of the land. Then you're going to be the first flying donkey in history, because I believe in shortcuts. Now, go try out your distance perception and coordination in that body. I'm afraid you're going to need to know how to kick the bejesus out of anything around you. So go practice on some defenseless tree. The donkey wandered off into the woods. I heard a whack every so often, so I wasn't worried. I sat down on a log with my pack and staff for a while. I closed my eyes and inhaled, appreciating the green smell of the forest glade along with the underlying smell of the rotting leaves feeding the rich undergrowth. I heard bleck. In my mind. What did you do? Take a bite out of a pine tree? How did you guess? Ah, no bet. They look good. The needles are acidic and strong, but the sap is nasty. Try clearing your mouth with a bite of green moss. Then try out a fruit tree. That should be up your alley. I smiled. I was tutoring a spirit in the art of being alive. Such a joy. I conjured up a bucket of wetted ground grain for the donkey and a lobster po' boy for me for dinner. I groaned at the taste of the sweet lobster, the sweet butter, the tangy slaw, and the sweet, nutty toasted roll. I asked the donkey, well, what tasted better, the grain or the po' boy? The grain was more immediate, more satisfying, but the po' boy was more complex, more memorable. I brought back my memory of my recent turkey dinner and replayed it for them. I felt that I was the center of attention of many, many beings. That's what made me ask the mother to grant all of you the ability to experience my thoughts, feelings, sensations, and memories. I felt that you were cheated in your lives and deserved more. I didn't know it, but I earned quite an army of true believers that evening. I wrapped us in a shell that would hold in the air and lifted straight up some 20 miles to generate a map of the local region in my mind. I kept us there until full dark, replacing the air with lots from the forest floor below to keep me warm and out of distress. I noted where I saw lights and how bright they were. I flew us to a larger cluster of lights and landed just outside of town. I read the sign. Milltown. My, how unimaginative. However, they were located on a quickly flowing river that guaranteed them power for their industry. I rode the donkey into town. What the hell should I call you? Let's go for Clyde. Gotcha. I hadn't kept up with what I looked like. The mother had marked me. The local population was about 5'4", white, black-haired, and blue-eyed. I was 6'9", black as coal, had green veins under my skin, and my eyes looked like milky opals. I also spoke with a deep, deep voice. I was a thing that nightmares were made of. My hands were nearly a foot across, and my feet were size 26. At least my teeth were square and not pointed. I walked into town to find a bar, and people left. The street was suddenly empty. I had no recourse but to watch for the signs of an ordinary. I found a broad house with a bush tied to a pole outside. I tied up my donkey at the rail and pounded on the locked door. I got no answer. I laid my hand on the door, passed my hand through it, and raised the bar. I pushed open the door and retrieved my hand, none for the worse. I sat down at a table and relaxed. Soon a head poked around the kitchen doorway. Got a beer and a bed. I can pay in silver, gold, or favors. At the prospect of a paying customer, no matter how strange looking, a smiling barkeep soon brought me a tankard of a pretty impressive brew. I told him that it was impressive too. So did several thousand spirits that spoke to my inner ear. I conjured up 5 silver coins the thickness of my index finger and as big around as a big hen's egg. I did a Mickey Mouse on the place, scrubbing the place down, cleaning the kitchen to within a smidge of its life, replacing the nasty though probably expensive as hell wall of slug glass wall with mullion windows, and laid a good coat of whitewash over the ceiling and walls. As a last gesture, I evicted all the creeping, crawling, and scuttling creatures out the back door. Most of the meat in the smokehouse was sour and inedible. I bespelled the smokehouse full of fresh, sweet smoked ducks and venison. The grain in the kitchen was infested with weevils and other nasty little critters. I evicted every damned one of them, emptied the grain containers and sanitized them, then bespelled them full of fresh grain. Likewise, the vegetables, cooking oil, and spices were replaced. I replaced the nasty brass pots and pans with good seasoned cast iron. I swore that if the morning cook didn't appreciate my work, I'd turn them into a diseased 304's toy. I woke up early to fulfill my pledge. I went down to the kitchen to find a middle-aged woman weeping in the kitchen. What's the problem? It's all so fine. I'm afraid to touch it for fear that it will all disappear in a flash and a puff. No fears, dear. It's all real, and it's yours. Now let's pound out some bread and biscuits, shall we? I hadn't had such fun in ages. I bashed out a huge pot of spicy sausage gravy for biscuits while she fried up eggs and rashers of bacon. The oatmeal was bubbling quietly at the back of the stove, and the kitchen smelled wonderful. I told her, wait until you see what I've done with the smokehouse. If you're this happy now, I might get my pipes cleaned. She blushed, then bashed me with a hip and grinned. I cast my mind about the place in a widening circle. The outhouse was a crime waiting to happen. I purged it and whitewashed it. There was no bathhouse within miles. Guess what factor Sims got the only bathhouse within miles? A clay pipe was cunningly run to fill the tub, and a hypocaust was put in to heat the water, not only for bathing, but for the cleaning of clothes. Then the water was drained away through more clay pipe to a close-by swamp. The place used to be a top-grade inn, but it had been let go. I had all the nasty, musty, moldy hay replaced by fresh, sweet feed and force-dried the barn in a matter of moments. I found the streamlet that had surfaced just inside the barn and rerouted it to a watering pond in the paddock. I forced a stone granary to be built and filled it with fresh cracked corn, cracked oats, and salt. All the years of accumulated shit in the stalls was removed to a manure pile outside. It looked and smelled clean again. I told Clyde, "Damn it, next time you clean up matters where you think it's beyond mortal hope. A good cleaning can spark a grand difference in attitude. Just watch." The stableman came out and stood there, amazed. His hands shook as he opened the stable doors. I came up behind him and spoke. "Thank the mother. When it seems hopeless, call on the mother. When there is no answer, call on the mother." He turned and saw me, then dropped to his knees. I brought him up by his arms. "Worship only the mother, not her priests. I was once as you. Now you see me after the mother has touched me. Let none profess to be a priest of the mother that appear as a normal man." I reached out and touched his forehead. I felt his mind expand as I touched it. He grew 12 inches, and his hair curled like that of a calf. I went back to the kitchen to help with lunch. People came for miles to eat there. Yesterday's stew was sour and poisonous from the bad meat. I conjured up a 20-gallon iron pot. I filled it with browned beef, carrots, onions, potatoes, sage, celery, and red wine. Then I pushed it in time to cook for 14 hours during the 2 hours we had until lunch. We spent the rest of our time baking bread, then toasting buttered flats to eat with the stew. A half hour before serving, I thickened the pot with a pound of flour and a pound of butter fried together in a wide pan until it gained color. The stew almost locked up, all 20 gallons of it. We sold the whole damned pot of it, and some were sad that we didn't have fourths for them. I pounded that recipe into her head until I knew she'd never forget it. I started 4 more big pots of the stew and made sure that Mary knew what I'd done. I had to expand her kitchen to accommodate the pots, but I made sure that she didn't notice. I also increased her oven space for the bread. I left her with the recipes for beef pot pies, pocket pies, sausage rolls, my biscuits and gravy, the recipe for flat noodles and mayonnaise. Now what roadhouse doesn't have sauerkraut? I summoned several big 80-quart glazed brownstone crocks and got a good vinegar mother working for her. Then I made sure she knew how to take care of them. Lastly, I taught her how to make pancakes and deviled eggs. I saw no reason for them to fail. Hell, they should do a landslide business. I sat against a tree and felt throughout the town. There had been an artificial dumbing down performed. I did not approve. The mother did not approve. A burst of undeniable power from the mother spread out over the area and brought the people to what they should have been. I went around proselytizing a lot that morning. I also set a lot of censor traps. If anyone probed the people that I'd sensitized to pulse would quickly alarm me, hopefully fast enough to make it to the site so that I could whack the shit out of whoever was responsible for dumbing down the people. Entire cities had been poisoned so that the people were going about like animals. I cleaned up as much as I could and tried to triangulate the path of whatever had hit the people with such an insidious effect. I eventually came face to face with the agent responsible for the dumbing down of the people. He was short, had curly black hair and a black beard. His skin was red, and he had 2 short horns protruding from his forehead. His feet were goofy, he had hooves. I felt him try to take over my mind. I watched him smile and become bemused. I lifted him into high orbit and turned him into a short-lived son. The next time I met his mama, she was not happy. Tough. She tried to slap me down in the worst way. I bounced up, ready for more. I finally got tired of her shit. I growled out, "I am Shiva. Look upon me and despair." I felt something odd happen on my forehead. Then she blackened and died. I kept my gaze on her until the blackened char flaked away into fly ash, and she disappeared. I'd somehow forgotten that Shiva's third eye was from where the god's destruction came. I prayed to the mother that night. "Mother, I fear that this race will not let this go. They have expended so much energy on this task that I fear they will refuse to back down in their effort to subvert this plane of existence." I felt the backwash of unendurable regret and pain. I know, Howard. I know. I crept into a ball and wept beyond all agony. The mother knew that she had to do something final to the horned ones and regretted it bitterly. I cried for her. I felt all the other spirits cry for her as well. At midnight, that frame of existence ceased to exist. I was so shaken that I wandered along the seacoast while Clyde followed faithfully behind me. Every so often, I carved an enormous temple to the mother into the seacoast cliffs, just to let the fisher folk know who provided their livelihood, and to let the mother know that we felt for her. I finally raised my head and became aware once again. Who was I to second-guess the universe? The mother made her decisions and lived with the result, irrespective of what one little animated smear might think. It was time to pick myself up by my asshole and get back to it. I had a world to convert, damn it. That was some 300 or 600 years ago. I'd gone through a few donkeys and several spirits as they opted out for other forms, but we always parted on good terms. I was old and feeble. I couldn't see for shit, and my hearing was shot to hell. I had one more decision left to make in my life. How did it go the last time? Oh yeah? I called out. Mother, please heal me, so that I may play more for you in joy. I woke as a tall brown-skinned youth. I must have been fairly young as I had no blue worms crawling across the backs of my hands, and saw no liver spots. I lay on a stone bier, made of cold black granite. The walls and ceiling soared above me. I could barely see but a small horizontal slit window way up high that gave me enough light to make out shapes. I knew that the mother held me fast, so I didn't panic. I swung my legs down to the floor where I found a pack bag under a necklace sporting a long, straight, clear crystal, a soft breech cloud, a tunic with a great tree embroidered across the chest, a large hank of very strong woven cord, a copper cup, a spoon, a sharp steel knife, a steel axe with a strong head and a shaft as long as my lower leg, a water gourd, a bag of salt, a fire-making box, 4 good beeswax candles, and a rolled-up waxed linen bag roughly 1 foot by 3 feet. A 12 by 16 canvas sheet was wrapped into a bundle and tied under it. I knew that the mother demanded that I use my mind. I took what I could of the room and examined the walls. One was chalky, made of some sort of stone and plaster, while the rest were of dressed granite. I used the back of the axe to strike at the weak wall, soon breaking free and opening a way out. I packed the bag and strode out, wondering what would come to me. Outside the sepulchre, I found a chest-high altar bearing a spear with a steel blade curved like a sickle and a steel butt piece fashioned like a faceted gem some 2 inches across. Also there lay a hauberk of chainmail with long sleeves that would stretch to my calves. I looked outside to see a decrepit temple covered in vines, brush, and moss. I realized that none would be coming to greet me. I opened my senses to the environment. From the tracks, nibbled shoots, and spoor that I saw, I knew that many small animals were close. I fashioned 4 snares and placed them in the animal runs, then gathered firewood and retreated back into the temple. It was dry within, while the afternoon breeze promised rain. 2 of my snares caught rabbits. I quickly cleaned them and had them on spits. It didn't take long to get a fire going made from the dead, dry vines mixed with the dead brush and trees covering the temple and surrounding it. The corner of the temple chamber appeared designed as a fire pit. The smoke crept up the wall to disappear above. The sight, sound, and smells of my little fire were comforting while the rain hammered down outside, lashing the leaves from the trees. I was glad that I had the foresight to gather extra firewood, as finding anything dry outside by that time and would be nearly impossible to light unless I split it to find the heartwood. The rabbits were done. One I left at the edge of the fire to dry while I ate the other with a pinch of salt. I stripped and went outside to wash off the grease as well as clean my body in the cold rain. Night was coming quickly. I carefully arranged 2 larger pieces of wood at the rear of the fire on top of each other to provide a gentle, longer-lasting fire, then wrapped myself in the canvas. Now that I was mostly dry once again, I dozed off happy, comfortable, and safe in the arms of the mother. I woke with a curious thought in my head. I knew that it was an old temple, and I'd never seen a temple that didn't have inscriptions all over it. Were the inscriptions on this temple still readable? The grooves making up the figures on the outer walls were so weathered that it was impossible to make them out, but inside I had a chance. I used a small torch fastened to the butt end of my spear to cast long shadows on the walls. Unless I knew what I was looking for, the writing would have appeared to be rows of scratches. I knew it to be the language of the Vikings runic. I couldn't read it, but I could recognize it. I felt quite frustrated in being so close, and I didn't even have anything to write on or write with to record it so that I could translate it later. I sighed and remembered an old homily. Spend yourself wisely. Strive to change what you may and accept that which you cannot. I went on with the rest of my day collecting water for my gourd and setting more traps for food. I had a ready source of meat available. It would be stupid to not take advantage of that. I dressed and went out to set traps, seek out vines to weave for baskets, and to see what else might be near the temple. I slowly walked in a spiral, watching for edible shoots, herbs, usable firewood, and game runs. I made certain to keep the temple within sight. I noted that the vegetation and trees were sparse in a line almost due east of the temple, taking the direction of the rising sun. Each time I set a snare, I topped and skinned the bark from a sapling next to it, leaving 6 to 8 feet so that I could locate it later. I had started back down the path to the temple when I heard a frantic squealing and crashing through the underbrush. I planted the butt of my spear on a root with my foot over it while aiming the point at where I thought the noise was coming from. It was approaching fast. I calmed myself, breathing deeply. If it was an enraged animal, I would have to act quickly and without hesitation. A yearling pig burst into view. It saw me and headed straight for me. Something had terrified it. It seemed bound and determined to go right through me. I caught it at the base of the throat with my spear, which gratefully did not slip or snap. The head buried itself in the pig's body, at which time the animal grunted and fell to its knees, then to its side. Luckily, I'd managed to cut open its heart. I put my hand on its shoulder as it lay there. I would have rather had you as a companion than dinner, but in your rush to meet your end, I couldn't stop you. I thank you for your gifts and promise to make the best of them as I am able. Rest well, sister. I carefully removed the spear and made 2 cuts. One was to slit its throat to let it bleed out, and one down her belly to the anus, which I ringed. I thrust my arm deep within to remove the entrails. I had to reach in with my other arm, delicately controlling the knife to sever the throat and windpipe, then cut away all the connective tissue. I was covered in blood by the time I finished the carcass. It was but the work of a minute or two to cut 2 larger saplings and fasten the body to them as a travois. Once I had the pig back at the temple steps, I carefully skinned the carcass, cut it down into portions that I could handle, then stripped and cut the meat thin, just the thickness of my smallest finger. I then wove an open dome of the small withes that would fit over the fire and lay as much salted meat as would fit over the coals. Next, I remembered my lessons. I speedily wove a broad, twisted grass basket that would cover the dome and the meat. When completed, I gently placed it over the meat to capture the smoke and greatly speed up the drying process. I had a lot of meat to prepare and had to force it. Cold smoking the meat would have made for a better product, but hot smoking it until it was leathery or even brittle would do fine for travel rations. I was still a sticky, bloody, dirty mess. I took my tools and searched out a small stream I'd seen while setting my snares. A good scrubbing with the clean bottom sand did wonders for my attitude. I came away with my spear, axe, and knife clean as well. I walked the path I'd taken when setting my traps, removing them. There was no sense in trapping rabbits with all that pork available. On the way back to the temple, I harvested more long grasses and withes. I'd need something to hold the dried meat. I spent the latter half of the day gorging on freshly cooked meat and feeding the little fire with damp wood, so as to cause smoke and not burst into flame. By mid-afternoon, I removed the covering basket, which was hot to the touch. The first batch was smoked dark and cooked down to shoe leather. I set aside the first batch and prepared a second. While that processed, I wove a basket nearly a foot across and deep as my arm out of tightly twisted grass twine. I could not see daylight through it, which was my goal. I packed away what meat was ready and continued to gorge. I wanted to waste as little of the porker that I could. I stayed busy scraping down the pig's hide. I wanted to make sandals out of the strongest part of it. By nightfall, the second batch of meat was finished. The third was started, after which I again packed away the finished product. For dinner, I removed the pig's tongue and roasted it in the coals. Peeled, it would make a wonderful meal. I had cut my oversized sandal soles out of doubled hide from the top of the back, where the skin was the thickest. I treated it like the meat by smoking and heating it against the bottom tier of the roasting rack. I'd cut some half-inch strips of the hide for laces and punched holes about the soles before they dried and became much harder to work. Just before going to my pallet, I turned the pig skins while I fed the fire once more. The tongue was done. It looked like an old stick from its time in the fire, but after peeling it with my sharp knife and dusting it with a bit of salt, I found it a very tasty, if chewy, delicacy. If I ever had the chance, I would cook one in a clay vessel with some spices and liquor thickened with gelatin from boiling the hooves. That would be fit for royalty. I thanked the mother for her bounty and prayed that I had made sufficient use of her gifts. I fell asleep after reminding myself to awaken as the fire cooled to tend to things again. I had much more meat to process and hoped to complete the task before it went off. It was the middle of the night when I next woke. The temple was warm from the fire working all day despite the heavy dew and spots of frost in the deep shadows outside. The gentle glow from the coals made it feel home-like and welcoming. I flipped the pigskins once more and replaced the meat on the rack with another batch. I found it a bit difficult to cut it properly in the dim light. A few small branches set on the fire gave me enough flame to guide my hands. I broke up the flames, put some larger wetted wood on the fire, and covered it all with some damp leaves. Once again, I covered the wood frame with the prepared meat, dusted it with salt, and covered it over for another long smoke. I lay back on my cot wondering again at the writing on the wall. I found it such an odd thing to be found deep in what was obviously a jungle. I thanked the mother for her gifts, her puzzles, and the rich life that I had been given. I woke as the forest creatures began stirring. The fire was almost out, yet the residual heat of the hearth kept the morning dew out of the temple. I stretched in my place and thanked the mother for another night safe in the comfort of her arms. I found it still too dark to work with the meat. I saw my hands pick up the necklace and place it about my neck. Then my voice said 2 very early runic words, stone light. The necklace was shining so brightly that I had to shield it with a hand as my eyes were watering and I saw purple spots. Wow, a flashbulb that keeps on giving. It was then that I realized I knew runic. I also knew what every encryption on all the walls read. It contained a paean to the mother, celebrating her gifts and her awesome foresight. The runes had been cut over 2,200 years in the past, yet their words still rang with power. The walls and ceiling of the small sepulchre in which I had lain was covered in lessons in how the runes fitted together to cast spells. I saw it all in a flash, the structure of how it all worked. I was terrified. I abased myself and called upon the mother. Please take this from me. It is like giving a child a loaded gun. I don't have the wisdom to use such a gift without causing unmeasurable harm in my ignorance. I felt the warmth of her approval. Be calm, little one. Do you not realize that I have given this gift many times before and know its pitfalls intimately? All magical power springs from me. I can allow or disallow the desires of a magic user, or even repudiate or call them home to me if their minds should not prove up to the task. I sighed and gave my thanks. I had nearly fouled my clout when I realized the true power of the spells. I could see how to call and dismiss cyclones, open fissures in the land, and cause great waves which would re-sculpt an entire seacoast. I wondered at what extreme condition would require a magic user to need such a thing. I hoped rather that it was an open-ended system in which power simply was, and its use was a matter of judgment. I began to see more moderate uses of such structures. I took a deep breath and centered myself. I still had the tasks before me to complete that I had set myself days before. I set my next batch of meat on the fire to smoke and cure. My sandals had finished smoking and drying. I ground a little pig fat into the edges of the smoked rawhide to keep it from cutting me as it aged and conformed to my feet. I whip-stitched the doubled layers together, wove and knotted in the basketry to cover over my arches, and set in the heel bands. I thought them rather handsome and utilitarian for a first attempt. I realized, however, that any hungry scavenger within smelling distance would follow closely and attempt to eat them. After gorging on all that pork, I got the expected result. I certainly fertilized a patch of trees and bushes. Upon waking, I was but skin and bone. I noticed that I was gaining muscles and wind. The sun was up, so I quenched my necklace. I considered my next step to be to gain knowledge of the area. I contemplated the wealth of spell structures I had been gifted with until I came upon a pair of already prepared spells that seemed perfect for my needs. I cast a spell upon myself for true sight. At first, I was overwhelmed by the complexity of all that was around me. I saw the life in every growing thing and couldn't help but notice useful plants and tubers all about me. Next, I cast a spell on myself granting strength, dexterity, and wind. I found myself immediately ravenous. I cut thicker slabs of pork to cook while I cut a digging stick and pulled up some nice starchy tubers. They were cast into the coals to cook. I feasted, then drank my fill of water and cleaned up. The last of the pork was put onto the rack to cure as night was falling. I deeply thanked the mother for the skills and eyes of an experienced hunter-gatherer and the body of a Zulu warrior in his prime. I slept once more, secure in a place that celebrated the mother, no matter how old and disused it may be. The mother may have been almost forgotten in that land by most, but she had at least one true devotee me. After my morning prayers and ablutions, I sat on the temple steps to plan. I knew that mother had plans for me that involved more than me parking my fat, but on the temple steps and basking in the sunshine like a family dog. If I didn't seek out my fate, I knew that mother would prod me into action in a most uncomfortable manner. I grinned to myself, remembering an old homily from my original life. If mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. I felt a ghostly pat on my head. Well, back to planning. I couldn't carry all that preserved meat in just one basket. It would be unbalanced and tiresome. I had to carve a shoulder yoke and weave another basket to level out the load. I was strong enough to carry quite a bit since the effects of the second spell had turned me into the very image of a pro football lineman. I had the eye to find roots, leaves, and fruits locally that may not be available elsewhere. I had already spotted feverfew, ginger, garlic, and burdock. I could see the purpose to which I would put that waxed bag. My herbs had to be harvested and most of them dried, which would take perhaps a week with the aid of the temple's warm air flue. I wanted a distance weapon, and an ATL seemed ideal. The darts were much more forgiving to make than arrows, and took less skill, and primitive bowstrings were a nightmare. After casting the true sight spell, I could easily make out the old road leading off to the east. I spent a couple hours weaving a harvesting basket, took my metal tools and started down the path to see what I could harvest or make use of. I had to cast a resizing spell on my jerkin and scale armor to make them fit my new larger size. I taught my eyes to watch for what would make a throwing stick, and to look for flint. Before leaving, I set some strips of hide to slowly simmer in water next to the fire. I'd need some glue. I found the remains of an extensive village. I was happy to find within one building several fat lamps. They were made from glazed clay, and several were nicely intact. I took two. Another place had glazed pots the size of my head hidden under 1.5 feet of soil. 2 were filled with salt and had been covered by pieces of leather tied around the lip. Those were prizes that I would have been foolish to ignore. There was no iron or bronze. If there had been any to begin with, it had gone back to nature over time. I was, however, amazed to find someone's cash under a hearthstone. A tiny bag held some 23 little flattened lumps of gold. I thanked the mother for this unexpected gift. It would make working with men much easier. It was then that I realized I could call wealth. I could see a spell to call to me any wealth within a day's walk that was either lost or buried and forgotten. Since the village was ancient, I didn't see the harm in trying it out. A moment after casting the spell, I heard a coughing noise and found 6 finger-sized round bars of gold and a gold bowl that would fit in my open hand. There were carvings and places for jewels all around the lip. This was quite a haul. I carefully cut off the end of my clout to wrap all the gold and placed it securely in the bottom of the basket. I spent a little more time looking for more ceramic pots as I wanted to refine and carry along some lard for the fat lamps. My luck had been used up gaining me the gold, though. I did spot a beautiful bent branch low on an Osage orange tree, which I had a difficult time cutting free. That would be my throwing stick once I did some carving and allowed it to dry. On a rise, I also found some tinder fungus. I harvested some for my fire kit. Once back at the temple, I smiled and relaxed, happy with my foraging. Then I frowned and called myself a fool. Why was I foraging when with a well-thought-out spell I could summon or create whatever supplies I desired? I sighed. I knew that it would take some time to get used to this magic business. I wondered how to strike a balance between foraging what was available and creating it on the fly. I was certain that there was some sort of logic, some ethical boundary or concept that I hadn't conceived of. I resolved to consult the definitive source, the mother. I deliberately and clearly phrased my question, called wisdom from the mother, and fell asleep where I was. When I awoke, I found that I'd been given a master's class in ethics for a wizard. I could create anything that would not imperil, undercut, disenfranchise, or dishearten others. I could not create anything living, for that was the purview of the mother alone. Any action of mine which caused physical or mental suffering to another were my responsibility to address. And if it were not addressed as soon as possible, then there was an excellent chance that the mother would turn me into fertilizer and take her time doing it so that it would hurt. Now that was a threat that I could understand. I realized that keeping everything looking natural was my best way of not drawing attention to myself or my belongings. I was already a blinding flash and a deafening report when I considered walking into a village as a 6'4" Nubian warrior dressed in iron scale mail and bearing an 8-foot iron spear. I wasn't what you'd call innocuous. I thought about it for a while, then called up a limited glamour or a seeming. Whoever or whatever saw me was going to accept what they saw as natural, normal, and nothing to get thrashed about. I carefully cast it with a loophole. I could suspend it at any time and turn into a roaring Billy Badass barbarian at the drop of a hat. Of course, that would blow my cover, so I'd have to be judicious in its use, such as convincing a barkeeper not to beat a servant or to keep a guard from thrashing a child or assaulting a girl. Abuses of power. I would feel completely vindicated halting that sort of thing. That brought up another thought that I had to address before I went much further. What was my mandate? What did I see as my mission? What course lay before me? The Chinese had some great homilies. One was, with great power comes great responsibility. Damn, I wasn't just some kid anymore. I was in the bigs. I had to keep myself under control with a strict thumb and mash down any inappropriate tendencies before they had a chance to actualize. I wanted the mother to be proud of me, not consider me a problem child that should be recycled for my weight in fertilizer or animal feed. I couldn't fix the world. I shouldn't go trying to search out the world's evil either. Life was balance, and every time the balance fell to one strength or another, populations died. Wolves had their place. Ecology was a hard taskmaster, or rather mistress. I spread out my possessions on the altar. I started in making adjustments. My carry sack got a hickory frame, shoulder straps, and a belt strap. I rebuilt the bag to hold my possessions as well. The 2 salt jugs became 4 square, very strong ceramic jars with closely fitted wood lids, sized so that all 4 would fill the bottom of my pack in 2 layers. I called up a wood box with a sliding top to hold the gold. I called into being cabochon cut and polished rubies to fill the voids around the lip of the gold cup. Another box was called up to hold my cooking bowl, spoon, a horn of hide glue, a large flask of oil, and another small steel knife. I knew what a fork and a spoon looked like, so I made myself one of each. Instead of carrying a water gourd, I created 2 water skins to hang off of the frame. The top layer of the bag held my cord in a canvas bag and my fire kit. It was a hefty pack, but not too bad. When I added the food panniers, I was a bit unhappy with the load. I called a mule. I knew that it may come from a ways away, so I occupied myself creating my ATLATL thrower and flights. I saw no reason not to just call up the flights, but the thrower I took my time with. I gradually carved and hand-rubbed the thing into existence. When I went to use it, I felt as if it were a part of my arm. It quickly became an accurate and powerful weapon in my hands. I made sure that my foodstuffs would not go off on me. After all, I didn't use the best method of preservation for all that pig, but I'd be awfully put out if it rotted. I put preservation spells on both panniers. Then I wondered what would be my cover. I needed a legend, a story to tell, and a reason to be wandering around. Hell, itinerant traders and spice merchants had a long history of running around loose, and nobody bothered them unless they were flat-out nuts. That brought other traders around in groups with bad attitudes. Besides, among traders I figured I'd get the freshest news and find out where the markets were. What to put together for inventory. It couldn't weigh too much, or both the mule and I would founder. As it was, I was going to lose one of those boxes of salt. In its place, I was going to carry a ceramic spice box. I knew what black pepper was, where it came from, what it tasted like, and what it looked like on the tree. The same with cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Now, it was possible that the mother had a taste for practical jokes, and this culture had railroads, ironclad steamships, and maybe even the telegraph, but I somehow doubted it. I was hoping for a pre-gunpowder civilization, and one that stayed that way. No electricity, no buildings over 3 stories tall, no jet engines, no internal combustion engines, and no goddamn cell phones. I hoped that the lever and rollers, block and tackle, and the Archimedes screw were as far as technology had progressed. I carried cards of straight pins and cards of needles, 20 sheathed knives with good steel similar to my own, a half-dozen axes, 6 pointed shovel blades, a few copper cups, a dozen packets of dry ink, and a handful of steel writing nibs. I told Mother what I had planned and didn't get any flack. Hopefully she wasn't feeding me enough rope to hang myself. We'd see. One afternoon, a big jack mule wandered into camp. He was a big fella. I fed him a few ripe apples and 2 quarts of cracked wheat out of a wood bucket. While he was chowing down, I contemplated if I knew any Doolittle spells. I didn't know any know-all languages spells, but I did have a way to learn one language or talk to one animal. I tried my talk to a mule spell. My eyes crossed, and I damn near fell over from balancing on 2 feet instead of 4 like a rational person. The clover smelled delicious. I grinned. That was pretty cool. I rubbed down Atlas. Hey, it was his name. As I talked to him, I said that I wanted him to carry a pack for me as I wandered around. In return, I promised to keep him fed, find good water, not overload him, and protect him not only from humans and animals, but the winter weather too. Hell, I didn't want to walk around in cold, miserable rain when I didn't have to any more than he did. He thought about it for a while. I added that there wouldn't be any bits, snaffles, or reins on him. Then he gave me a horsey head nod and blew a snort in my hair. I figured that was close to a handshake that we were going to get. I measured his back by hand, then called up a saddle pad and a pack saddle. I fiddled with things until he seemed happy with the fit. Then I added my food panniers and another pair that held food for him. I had a 20-pound bag of dried apples up there across from a 20-pound bag of white flour too. Strapped over everything was a bucket, a 30 by 30 canvas tarp, and a couple blankets. We were ready to go. I cast a small spell to clean up my mess in the temple, then a finder spell to see where we should be going next. Something inside me said that repairing or fixing up the temple would not be appropriate. The magical compass in front of my eyes took us due east, down the road through the ancient village. I said, looks like we're headed this way. Let's see how far we can get before we find fresh fodder for you and good water. We set a good pace off into the woods. We had half a day to see what was stored for us. The next morning, the temple floor was covered in large pit vipers, which had been out of sight in the hidden ways deep inside the walls. None would use the mother's temples without her blessing. The land soon became rough, then more and more mountainous as the trail led ever upward. The trees shifted from deciduous to coniferous. The lowland animals thinned, and only a few fur-bearers or larger predators ruled. Atlas and I were attacked late one evening by a pack of wolves. Despite my size and skill, without magic I doubted that we would have survived. I quickly learned to shoot pebbles like a rifle bullets, and thereby dispatched the entire pack. They had been eating well, living off of travelers on the trail. Well, I put the finish to that. I used magic to tan and sew together the skins to make a hooded cloak and a generous sleeping fur. I duplicated my wool blanket twice and sewed them into a thick quilt to keep Atlas comfortable enough at night to stop his grumbling. He was happy enough that I cleaned stones from his hooves twice daily and thanked me, in his way. As it got colder, I made a warm grain mash for him each evening. I nearly filled the bucket, but as I previously noted, he was a big fellow and ate it all. I let him know that he'd better eat whatever grasses he could find or he'd get bound up from all the grain. We We stopped whenever we could so that he could crop a few mouthfuls of sweet grass. We came upon a shelter in a valley. It boasted a clean if cold little stream and a lush patch of grass, which Atlas soon set about devouring. 2 other parties of traders were already there, sitting before the fire while sipping buttered tea. They offered some which I tried and thought delicious. In return, I offered a pound of my dried apples, which made marvelous dough puddings and pies. They had been on the trail quite a while and had long before run out of any fruit, including dried, so they were quite happy in their turn. The conversation turned to news of the road. They were quite concerned about stories of a rapacious pack of wolves that was said to be large enough to take down a short pack train. I grinned and showed off my new sleeping furs. You mean this wolf pack? They asked my name. I drew a blank until I said out of nowhere, Simon from Casablanca, near the gates of Hercules. One man said, you must have itchy feet to have traveled so far. The mountains of Romania are far from your home. I nodded. I have a religious calling. I judge for the mother. An old man spoke up. You travel a difficult path, warrior. I smiled. I am pointed the way. Though the steps be many and the path difficult at times, I always find times to enjoy, such as this. We tapped cups, then made our ways to our sleeping pads. I prayed to the mother, giving thanks for this chance to speak with others on my lonely road, and fell asleep. Atlas was raising hell. I sat up and found my feet, my sword staff in hand. I ran outside to see what the problem was. 2 men were trying to take Atlas off his feet, while another stood ready with a knife. Another 2 were rifling my packs. I took up a small handful of pebbles and gave each of them a third eye. They dropped like sacks of grain. I wrapped my necklace about the butt of my staff and drove the blade into the ground, then brought up the light at its brightest. It hissed in the night, driving back the darkness with a brilliant white actinic light that broke the dark for over 90 paces in all directions. I tossed the bodies into a pile and checked Atlas. He was healthy and unwounded, although pissed. All the others from the shelter were up, gawping at the sight. I called out, I am a judge of the mother, and I find you wanting. A complicated spell spilled from my mouth that let me see the guilt in each man. Only one still alive showed treachery. He soon joined the others dead on the ground. I sighed and shook my head. Greed certainly drew the stupid, the venal, and the avaricious. Well, to the victor goes the spoils. I quenched the crystal's light, then retrieved my pack and sleeping furs. I rebuilt the fire. I would sleep there under the watchful eye of Atlas for the rest of the night. I made sure his quilt was near for him and lay down until dawn. I had shown myself the previous night. The remaining trading party quietly packed up, salaamed to me, and left up the trail from whence I had come. After a boiled grain and dried apple breakfast, I checked my panniers. My grains, dried apples, and preserved meats were getting low. I used a short series of spells to refill each bag and pannier. My salt and oil supply were likewise low and were magically replenished. I searched each body from neck to ankles to see what they brought to the table. Knives I found in profusion, though most were of inferior quality. I put them aside in a bundle as I could improve them through the arts into something worth selling. Their garments were ill-made and reeked of old sweat and fug. In the daylight, they proved to be an ugly group, none of which would I have trusted with so much as a bent copper. 8 mules stood about the camp besides Atlas. I went to each, removed their bits, and fed them warm grain mash. None were in good shape. I could see that I would be spending a month or so at that camp until they were ready for the trail once again. I checked their hooves and rubbed them down, making much of them. I duplicated Atlas' quilt until I had one for each of the new mules. Atlas realized that they were now part of his responsibility as my head mule. He went among them, nosing one, snorting with another. I could see them slowly take their ease and relax. I fed them grain twice a day. With the aid of the mother, the grass grew prodigiously, enough to keep them all fed and comfortable when at rest. I had the time to search through the packs the dead men had left me. Their food was thoroughly nasty. I disposed of it down the ravine along with their corpses. The only food worth keeping was their tea, sugar, and butter for the tea. They had some very nice woven rugs which needed cleaning. One must have been the chief or leader, as a small locked chest or till was in his luggage. I convinced the lock to open, finding coins of various countries and a small selection of gemstones. Now I knew what a copper looked like, a silver, and a modern gold. I performed my wealth-finding spell, which gained me only a few silvers and a large amber ring and a gold mount that were obviously lost and forgotten in the sleeping shelter. The ring, gems, and all the gold joined what I had before, while I fashioned a doubled leather bag for the copper and silver. Each man had a bit of cooking gear and a jalaba, a long dark robe with a deep hood. I called up fresh pads and sawbuck pack frames for each mule. Once their lesions had healed, the frames would sit in different spots on their backs so as not to irritate them further. I searched around the camp for the finest pitch-bearing pine knots. After using my arts to thoroughly clean the shelter, I replenished the firewood with duplicates of the pine knots and stowed a bag of 20 on each pack frame, along with a bag of apples and a pair of panniers filled with grain for each beast. Some carried shovels, some axes, some rope, and some canvas. All carried a wood bucket. When the mules were healed and had gained some weight, we headed down the trail in a pack string. Perhaps 2 weeks later, we came down out of the hills onto a beautiful plain. My compass pointed me down the road. Forward, ever forward. We stopped for a break in a lovely glade with a brook at one edge. The grasses were lush and deep green, making the mules nicker and nod in anticipation. I pulled off their packs and pads, wiped them down, and let them go to it. I knew that they would not roam, as they were greedy pigs who had come to love their daily warm mash. I smiled as I watched Atlas roll, scratching his back after days under the pack. The others got the idea and soon were doing the same. They were kicking up their heels and chasing each other. I was so happy to see them frolic together that it brought tears to the back of my throat. Seeing that little brook, I brought out my cordage and wove a little net, some 6 feet on a side, then tied rocks to the edges and lines to the corners. At a blind bend where the water quickly rushed then formed a pool, I cast my net and quickly pulled it in. I was happy to see 4 nice-sized fish. I had a fresh dinner. I searched the little valleys to either side of the brook where I found garlic and onions. I called up a little 3-legged pot with a lid holding perhaps 2 quarts. I soon had a fire going. With a couple potatoes from my panniers, I had a chowder merrily bubbling away. It would take a while to cook. I made some tea and relaxed while leaning back against Atlas' pack frame. Atlas came sniffing around to see what smelled so different. I made up his bucket of warm mash and added 2 handfuls of dried apples, always a favorite treat. His eating brought the others who wanted their share as well. They were spoiled, I admit it, but they were as happy as their lives could be under the circumstances, and they seemed to understand that. Once everyone was fed and settled down for the evening, my dinner finally smelled done. I scooped out a serving, added a bit of salt, and dug in. Unremarkable, but filling. I thought that it needed tomatoes, but try and find a tomato in the Baltic in the 1500s. Making any appear would certainly draw attention. I heard, "Hello, the camp." I replied, "Come ahead, if you bear no ill will." I focused on my true sight. I saw nothing but a young man and a girl. I brought out 2 more bowls and poured out servings. As was usual for the time, everyone carried their own spoon. I sprinkled some salt over their dishes and pushed them towards where they had sat near the fire. I was surprised when they both gave me a slight bow and raised their hands in a prayerful salute to their foreheads. I had thought that more an Indonesian or Thai greeting than one coming from Bucharest. I raised a palm to them and said, "Give thanks to the mother." They smiled brightly and dug in. I was full, but obviously they weren't. I refilled their bowls with a smile, then went off to the brook to appear to clean the pot. I gave it a lick and a promise, along with a quick spell, and it was good as new. I felt good about this pair. Need a job? It comes with a blanket and free dinner. I need help tending the mules. They looked at each other for a second, during which I felt a little buzz behind my ears, then looked back at me, smiled, and nodded. I grinned. They were untrained mages. I cast a tiny little spell and said to them while keeping my mouth closed, "I can do that too." They liked to fell over backwards, then laughed and hugged each other. I told them, "This may be a deal breaker. I am a warrior and judge for the mother. I am more than I appear." I dropped my glamour and calmly sat there, sipping my tea. I could feel the fear come off of them, but they bravely swallowed it. The girl said, "You are a mage. Will you train us?" I raised my glamour again to make things more comfortable. I sighed. I cannot. I don't have the wisdom to know who to train and who not to train, who will help the world prosper and who will rip free what they can, simply because they can. You must pray to the mother. Only she can grant this. Only she has the right. Wisdom is gained over time, and only the mother is millions of years old. They nodded. It wasn't what they wanted to hear, but they could hear the truth behind my words. That was all a part of the primitive true sight that they both had. I prayed that night for direction. By morning I felt fulfilled. My compass had disappeared. I rose and watched them grow and stretch in their sleep. They had been perhaps 10 years old when they found my camp the previous night. From their looks they were now in their middle teens. They would be ravenous upon waking. I set out with my ATL for game. I ran lightly on the balls of my feet, once more watching, seeing, carefully choosing my path. I tracked down an elk that a large cat had been stalking. I quickly killed it, gutted it, and cut it in half. I took the rear quarters, leaving the guts and forequarters for the cat. It was an older male with a damaged forepaw. He would have made a mess of the kill. This way the elk died cleanly and still fed the cat. Once he had fed, I caused him to drowse, then sleep. I examined his paw. It had been crushed. I withdrew the bone splinters that kept shifting and reversing his healing. Then I caused the remaining bone fragments to bind together and fuse. He would be back in fine shape soon. He was too young to die. He had many fine litters left in him to father. I returned to camp with the meat. I called forth a cauldron and made a strong fire beneath it. I shredded the meat into the pot so that it seared, then added water, potatoes, garlic, onions, grain, and bay leaf. It needed 2 to 3 hours to cook. I somehow knew that they would not rise before noon. I would have to keep stirring it to keep the grain from sinking to the bottom and sticking into a glob, then burning. I tasted it and was happy. I had a cupful myself. It needed some salt and pepper, but it was fine. Hell, thicken it a bit. Throw it into a tortilla and add some fresh onion, and you'd have one hell of a taco. I sat there tending the stew, reminiscing about street food. It had been ages since I'd thought about it. Maybe it was time to introduce fish and chips to an unsuspecting crowd, or perhaps some spicy pork tacos made from preserved meat. It would certainly surprise people. All I'd have to do was serve it and reveal the ingredients on a banner the following week. I felt a firm slap from an invisible hand on the back of my head and blushed. I'd always been a shit stirrer. I murmured, "Sorry, Mom." Got carried away there. I fed the kids and watched them try to cope with their new status in life. They were pretty out of it. No doubt I had been as well, but I'd been all alone where nobody could mess with me. I was on alert with my weapons at hand, watching in several ways. Luckily for any intruder, none were seen, because as a guardian, I wasn't in a very forgiving mood. A phrase came to mind: interfere not in the affairs of wizards, for ye could easily be crunchy and good to eat with ketchup. It sort of crystallized the mood of the day. They ate, they slept. They ate, they slept. They grew to stink so badly, I threw the both of them in the creek, clothing and all. That got their attention. I stood there with my fists on my hips and read them the riot act. Clean up so you don't stink, or I'm going to drop you into a nice, deep ocean and let you swim back. Properly chastised, they scrubbed themselves and their clothing. I broke down and gave them a couple bars of soap, then dried their clothes for them after they rinsed and came out. I'd gone through half an elk, a sheep, and 2 goats feeding those kids. It was about time that they woke up. The mother told me that they knew runic now, but didn't know that they knew runic. I sat down with them on a couple of logs and began bootstrapping them into their new lives. First, I called for crystals and gently convinced some tree roots to become cages for them. Then a bit of my cordage got turned into necklaces. I showed them my crystal, then did the basic light spell on it. That captured their imagination. I brought them back to reality by making them put the pads and pack saddles on the mules. Then I used the jalabas and storage as models to make gray robes for them, as was proper for initiates. I wore the black robe of a master. I cast glamours on the 2 of them so that they didn't remind anyone of a pair of kids that had fled the city. We walked into town. The smells were indescribable and not very pleasant. In some ways, I found the state of things to be equivalent to 800 AD. In others, perhaps 1300, as steel was known and highly prized. It was a city, and pretty big one for the time. Bucharest had long been a summer retreat for royalty, so there was a mixed population looking for employment, to buy and to sell, and many others to steal. Now, I was funny about equal opportunity employment. I didn't really care who got ripped off or robbed, as long as it wasn't me. When I felt an adventurous hand groping my goodies, I caused the owner of the hand to accelerate straight up, screaming all the while, until they reached about 30 feet. Then I let them fall. It happened a few times before the local boys and girls got the idea. Cause and effect along with the scientific method hadn't really sunk into the general population yet. The city guard? Oh yeah, like they were going to be any different. I was pointed to a trader's hostel on the edge of town, where land was cheaper and we could find a place to keep the beasts. The mother had done something unusual to my current reality. I saw large lizards under harness. They looked as if they'd move like a bat out of hell. With those mouthfuls of teeth, though, I'd hate to be the one keeping them in meat. I also spotted a team of 4 Asian elephants. Now those big boys were hay burners. I traded a handful of silver for a week's care for my string of mules. Along with the use of a caged corner in the hostler's guarded warehouse, I had to provide either a ticket to gain access or get the permission of the hostler if the ticket went missing. My pack went with me. I provided simple packs for the kids with eating tools and some silver too. It was no big thing to provide them with steel daggers, sheaths, and belts. I had learned that their names were Hiram and Odell. We took a second-floor room above the hostelry for a week. I had no idea how long our tasks would take. A week seemed prudent as I got a reduced cost for the room. The ordinary across the way served stew, spit-roasted meats, and roasted tubers. The stew smelled good, but we'd been gorging on stew for a week, which took the shine off of it. I ordered spit-roasted birds and tubers for the 3 of us. The birds were well cooked, and the tubers were yams. I asked for a small tub of butter, which we slathered over our cut-up yams. It all went down well with small beer. Afterward, we visited the privy, then went back to our room. I had rented a small dorm with bunks, a table, and chairs for 4. We sat at the table, and I dug out my box containing the gold. Their eyes opened wide when they saw a veritable fortune on the table before them. I smiled and passed around the cup. It was old and heavy, made before goldsmiths had learned to create delicate works. I smiled at them. Watch carefully. This will stretch the limits of the mother's generosity, but I think she may allow it this once. I'm going to make a door knocker for a very special set of doors. I placed the cup on the table and, visualizing the spell, drew it into 2 cups of the same size and weight. When the spell finished, I exhaled the breath that I didn't know I had been holding. A matched pair of cups should bring much more attention than just one. They looked at me in wonder. I had just shown them that they need never suffer for the lack of food or a warm place to sleep, ever again. I explained, we are constrained from performing any spell that harms another physically or mentally. If you put a businessman out of work, you have just harmed him. We can injure a man simply by devaluing his stock or the value of his coin. If I filled a bucket full of emeralds and sold them, it would depress the value of emeralds for miles around. Anyone trying to make a living mining, collecting, shaping, or selling emeralds would quickly be out on the street, begging for food. I put the cups back into their box and then in my pack. Out of safety concerns, I put my pack against the far wall between 2 bunks. I continued. This is how to collect a bit of coin in a place where it hasn't been done before. It seeks out lost or forgotten wealth. I shall limit my casting to 200 paces, as I have no idea what the spell will come up with in an old city like this. I carefully enunciated the spell for them, then tried to prepare for anything. I heard several loud pops, and the table between us creaked and collapsed under the load. A great cloud of dust flew everywhere. I waved my hand in front of my face and coughed, then sneezed. It seemed that at one time wealth in the city was measured in iron bowls, great iron sand-poured discs with 4 large knobs around the edges, like the legs on a bull's hide. I rose and stacked the bowls on edge next to the door. Some 18 were there. They each weighed about the same, that of an adult man. It was no wonder the table collapsed. I took the canvas from my pack, spread it out on the floor, and covered it with the rest of the pile, putting the pieces of the table to one side. I'd be able to fix that later. We started isolating different coins by size and metal. There were what appeared to be jade rings and highly figured round discs with square holes in their centers. I was suddenly very glad that I didn't specify trade goods rather than trade specie. I put away the 3 large handfuls of gold and coin and bar. We split the sliver 3 ways. Odell liked the jade rings, and Hiram liked the pierced coins. I gave them what we had, and supplied some cordage to make necklaces for them. While they admired their new finery, I turned the 60-odd pounds of copper into 10-pound ingots, and set them aside, then put the parts of the table back together, upside down. I told them, I've not tried this before, but it should be possible. I cast a spell of wholeness and strengthening. The rickety excuse for a table transformed into a heavy trestle table with a 2-inch thick top. It took all of us to turn it right side up. I grinned. I'll have to remember that one. I hired a carter and 2 muscle men to take the iron bowls down to the smith's quarter, where I ran an impromptu auction. I sold off all the copper and the bowls for 48 silvers. The bowls went for 3 silvers each. They had a reputation as being made of good steel. A 10-pound bar of copper netted 1 silver. These exchange rates had a basis in labor. A good worker could expect 5 or even 6 coppers for a day's work. A silver was a month's wages and weighed 4 times that of a copper. Depending on its size, a gold was worth from 6 months' labor to a decade. The finger-sized bars were worth 10 years of a man's labor. A finger of gold weighed perhaps 4 ounces. The cups weighed over 3 pounds each. This was why I was so worried about the mother allowing that spell to succeed. Many men's lives hung in the balance. Assassins could be hired, prisoners freed from jail, spies bought in the royal court. Even laws could be made or overturned which could affect the city-state for decades, if not centuries. In an attempt to moderate such power, I used a steel graver to carve runes into the bottoms of the cups stating we are gifts to the mother. Then I cast a gentle obscuration spell over the runes. There. If the mother didn't like what was being done with them, she could pick up her marbles and go home. Hopefully, writing the legends in runic gave them more power and brought them closer to her hand. They were dedicated to her. I had to bootstrap my way into my next task. I left the 2 kids back at the ordinary while I located the jeweler's quarter, then found a tea shop that also served as a meeting house. I ordered a pot of tea and sat waiting for anyone to show interest in me. I had to dial back my obscuring spell, as I didn't want to blend into the background quite so much. 3 men approached my table. I bid them stay and poured small cups. The men that made their businesses in that shop didn't drink large cups lest they lose out on deals while at the privy. I brought out some of the more interestingly figured gold coins. I told them about my trainees having the coins with square holes in their centers and the jade rings. I was curious to see one of them sit back with his eyes glazed over. I assumed that meant that they were more than what met the eye. It's hard to disguise intent when someone's pupils suddenly expand. I made arrangements to meet with their factor the next day. I didn't know what sort of presence the mother maintained in that city, or even if she was out of favor, so I was hesitant to inquire as to where her temple lay. I cast a finding, then took a deep breath, made myself appear to merge with the shadows, and let it out. I took care while following the trace. I watched the doorways, the rooftops, and the others on the street. I felt for the eyes of others on me. I carried a handful of coppers in my offhand that I could use as bullets if necessity drove me that far. My seeking took me to the far eastern edge of the city, several miles away. The mother's temple was a small stone building beside the entrance to a farm. It appeared to be a reliquary rather than a temple. The path was overgrown with brush, grasses, and small trees. Rather than pull the brush, I laid my palm on the ground, then cast a small spell in the form of a prayer, honor the mother. Slowly the underbrush pulled toward either side, leaving a clean white path down the middle. I cast what was becoming one of my favorite spells on the building, repair and strengthen. The stones shifted, the walls trued, and the gray left the stones. When I walked inside, I felt the barest flicker of the mother there. This simply would not do. What was left was but a vestibule of what was. The temple had been robbed of its very structure for others to build with. I abandoned my plans for infiltrating the ruling hierarchy of the city. This was more important. I recalled how the temple in the jungle was built. I called stone after stone, placing them into the old foundation holes and rebuilding the walls. I judged the angles by eye. If it had a pleasing appearance to me, then I hoped it would have the same for her. It soon grew dark. I caused my crystal to glow brightly and continued my labors. I had built a reclining bench at the rear of the sanctuary some 18 feet long. The ceiling rose to 24 feet. Then I started the delicate process of building a dome. I called for blocks of rose quartz to complete the last 6 courses and placed a large clear faceted quartz crystal at the peak to illuminate the interior during the daylight. I recalled how the offering fire dish and flue were constructed in the old temple and duplicated that work. When I judged the structure sound, I once again cast a repair and strengthen spell, locking the entire building into one monolithic block of stone. I was pleased to watch the seams between the stones glow yellow-red, following from seam to seam around the building and up to the top of the dome. When it had finished, I couldn't find evidence of a single seam left behind. I called my pack and my sleeping furs to me. I took up one of the consecrated bowls and called water to me to fill it. I then chanted the paean to the mother that had been etched into the stone walls of her temple so many centuries before, as I used my fingers to sprinkle clean water over the walls and floor. I slowly began to feel her presence as the walls began to glow with a gentle green light. I smelled spicy growing things like moss and the sweetness of swamp iris. I was tired, and I was finished. I lay down on my furs, said one final prayer to the mother and the lady in thanks for my abilities, and prayed for the wisdom to use them without harm. I fell asleep on a soft, welcoming bed. When I rose, I found my 2 trainees sitting near the doorway, watching me. I curiously asked, "How did you find me?" Hiram said, "We didn't. We woke up here out of a sound sleep. Did you know that this entire temple is glowing green? I rebuilt it over most of yesterday and last night. Then I reconsecrated it to the mother. Your mage sight allows the 2 of you to see many things that others cannot. You have been influenced by the physical power of the mother in your healing. Now you have seen a little of her deeper strength. When you worship her or pray to her and feel her arms about you, this is true witness to her being touching yours. Your futures are not yet clear, but if like me your paths are that of the warrior priest, many things will become clear to you, both terrifying and overwhelming." I heard Atlas nicker from outside. I walked out along with my 2 scrubs to find all our mules and packs. It appears that the mother thinks we would best serve her here than in town. I looked about the old, decrepit farm behind the temple with a new eye. This had been the property of the temple. When the offerings failed and the worshippers went elsewhere, the priests and celebrants either died or went to other temples, allowing the land to become fallow, then overgrown. I cut a wand, then began walking the periphery of the farm while tracing the boundary with the wand. As I walked, I found myself chanting a paean to her and walking in a slow, stately march. At each corner, I said a phrase which I didn't understand, then turned and continued my walk. I finished at the far side of the temple. At the end, I loudly said, "So let it be in the name of the mother." The heavens seemed to reply with a roll of thunder from horizon to horizon. I said, "Quick, let's get the shelter up for the mules. I want them under cover if this turns into a street cleaner." We set up the awning against the side of the temple, then hacked all the pack saddles inside the temple before the rain started. I stood at the rear door of the temple, watching the deluge flood the rampant undergrowth. I started nodding and bowing, then closed my eyes. I saw a productive temple farm in my mind's eye with vegetable and grain fields, grazing cows, pecking chickens, and a lush orchard. I smiled and whispered, "In the name of the mother and the lady, let it be so." I fell to my knees as a wave of unstoppable power flowed through me and out into the ground before me. It was the last thing I remembered seeing for days. I dreamed of many long conversations sitting beside the fire, accompanied by a beautiful woman. I was tutored in many subjects such as healing and managing plants from within. I saw the mites, the spiders, the bees, the voles, the birds, mice, and the deer all from within their own skins. I understood the place the squirrels had and learned to influence them. What's more, I learned to teach what I knew to others. That nearly wiped me out. Everything started to get hazy. "What am I going to do with you?" She wryly said. "I can't keep your attention whether you're awake or asleep. Feed me peanuts and listen to me squawk like a parrot." I heard her peals of laughter as I faded out into a deep black sleep. It seemed like only an instant before I woke. Wow, was I thirsty. I groaned as I sat up. Where the hell was I? I saw a fireplace, a low open window with thick panes of glass, and through that, some sort of garden. The walls were made of stone, and the ceiling was wood, as was the floor. I stood up, then sat down much faster. Head rush. The second time I took it easy. I was naked as a jaybird as I walked out the door looking for a way outside. I needed a privy in the worst way. Odell turned the corner with a pitcher and glass in her hands. The sight of me startled her so much she almost dropped them. "Master, you're naked. Hold that thought. I'll be right back." "Oh, find me a robe, would you?" I knew she was watching my buttocks as I walked down the corridor. After all, if we'd swapped places, I'd sure be admiring hers. I made it back inside a lot calmer and a quart low. She was blushing up to her hairline. I grinned, took the proffered water glass, and finished it in one long pull. You can tell when water just came from a well bearing lime and iron. The flavor is unmistakable and delicious. I exchanged the water glass for my robe that was draped across her arm. I shrugged into it, then gave a tendon-snapping stretch, which made my breastbone hurt. "Where are we?" She quickly became businesslike. "We are on the farm behind the temple to the mother. When you finished your invocation, you fell over as if struck by an axe handle. That was 4 days ago." She broke her calm demeanor. "I've been worried sick." I gave her a nice, easy hug to get her to relax. "I'm back and everything will be all right." I walked outside with her under my arm for a look around. The farm I'd originally seen looked nothing like what I was currently seeing. The place was a showcase. I heard the pounding of hooves as Atlas came around the corner and plowed to a halt in front of me. Then he gave me a big horsey-type hug with his neck as I squeezed him and told him how much I'd missed him. He sniffed me up and down and poked my chest with his forehead. I knew an invitation for a scratching when I saw one. After a while, we walked around what turned out to be the farmhouse, Odell under one arm and Atlas under the other. I saw fields, trees, orchards, and more fields. I faintly said, "What happened to this place?" It was a wreck. I figured that we'd be spending at least 3 years here getting it into shape as we built a congregation. Odell quietly said, "You and the mother happened to it." Her eyes searched my face. "You should see yourself. Your skin shines dark green from within, as does your hair. Your eyes are the color of a winter pine tree." I thought about it philosophically. It beat bright red with horns and pointed teeth. They'd have run me out of town in a heartbeat. Worse if they caught me. "Have you seen Hiram? He's in town looking for farmers. Those crazy old coins you gave us almost got us in trouble until we explained that we were acolytes of the mother. We watched what you did with your crystal and made a big stone burn bright green. After that, city guards followed us around. They said it was to keep us safe, but the way they were watching us, I figured that it was to keep everyone else safe from us." I snickered. "During our next class, I'll show the both of you how to make a rock act like an arrowhead shot from a very strong bow, without needing the bow, bowstring, shaft, knock, or fletching. Stones are nice, but copper coins seem to scare people more. No doubt you could do the same thing with a paving stone, or even something bigger. It's easier to keep a handful of coppers available, though." I walked into the temple looking for my pack. I found it resting on the stone bed I'd made at the rear of the temple. With it were my furs, jerkin, clout, scale mail, and panniers. Some 30 people were wandering around the temple, astounded at its structure and cleanliness. I quietly asked Odell to go gather some ripe produce from the field as I ministered to the people. They were not celebrants because they were the poor. They had nothing to celebrate. I called up a 20-gallon iron pot and a grate that sat over the hearth. I knew the pack saddles still bore those big pine knots that I'd stashed. I called up 2 and duplicated them into a rather tall wood pile. I piled a few together in the hearth and called fire to light them off. The smoke perfumed the air with the smell of the pine resin. I talked as I worked. We celebrate the mother in all the things we do: cleaning, washing, gardening, cooking, and tending the children. If you think of the mother as you perform these actions, then you are doubly blessed. The feel of the warm sun warming your back as the early morning dew dries from your clothes. The feeling of your muscles stretching both before and after work. I prepare this food for you in the name of the mother and hope that you sweetly anticipate its flavor and richness, then the feeling of satiation once you have finished. I used a large piece of my preserved pig, which I recalled back to its original form and duplicated until the kettle was over half full. I included squash, beans, potatoes, onion, and garlic. Once it all softened and merged together, I dipped out servings into wood bowls with my camp cup and gave wood spoons to those desperate enough not to have even that. I served up cups of savory buttered tea to all of them as they leaned back against the walls. I slowly sang the old paean to the mother while they smiled and nodded their heads in time. I saw the walls start to glow green once again. I called blankets for them all, my first congregation. Admittedly, they were closer to the animals in the fields, but they truly needed what was offered. I walked from sleeper to sleeper, healing the worst of their afflictions with what I had been taught by the mother. Hiram came back with a family of farmers. I provided a dozen laborers from those that I fed that would work for food, shelter, clothing, and sanctuary. Several bankers and their muscle were running a scam wherein the children, wives, and families were held accountable for the debts of people that had disappeared or died. The mother allowed to me to take action in these cases. Those found guilty were cursed. They soon grew horns of shame. Over half the bankers in the city were turned into devils with horns, bright red skin, and the eyes of a snake, including several of those holding high offices in the government. The people had had enough. The horned ones were hounded to the harbor where their choice was to be speared to death or forced to jump into the harbor waters. Once their men with long forked poles pushed those attempting to climb out back in until they all died of exhaustion and floated downstream. Within a week it was as if a great pact was sworn. The matter was never spoken of again. There was one further fallout to the plague of the horned ones. Bankers, traders, and storekeepers that often gouged their customers were accused of covering something up, while their customers gazed significantly at their foreheads. Nervous merchants tended to move out of the city. Gradually, my skin tone shifted back from green to a more normal brown. At the same time, I slowly grew uncomfortable. I described it as itchy feet. By the middle of spring, I'd had enough. The kids were doing well enough on their own. It was time to reassemble my pack string and leave. Atlas looked like he was ready to do some traveling as well. With 3 mules behind me, I headed out of the city gates to the southeast. I had a long way to go. I'd left a celebratory bowl with the kids along with some of the gold and most of the silver. The kids had memorized the paean to the mother for the services and had agreed to stick around the temple until something better came along. My pork was still as fresh as the day I'd made it thanks to the spells I'd laid on the panniers. The wolf skins were looking a bit ratty, so I applied his repair and strengthen spell on the cloak and sleeping furs. It made them as dense as a grizzly bear fur, yet still soft and comfortable from the heavy layer of guard hairs. Those damned pigskin sandals still had a lot of miles left on them. As I walked, I opened himself up to the life around me. The gifts of the mother were varied and freely given. It humbled me to feel that I was part of it all. I had become irreverent with the power available to me and what had flown through me. I must bring myself under control. The only way I could think of achieving this was through contemplation and prayer. My task was not to proselytize, but to bear witness for the mother, then to do my level best to act as she would wish me to. It took much diligent prayer and contemplation to subdue my own will into that of the mother. My prayers tended to be requests for guidance and to bring humility to my life. Only by acknowledging my responsibilities and debts could I act in an honorable fashion. The old homily rang through my very being: with great power comes great responsibility. I gained clarity of purpose and my stride lengthened. Whenever I came upon a campsite that felt right, with good water and fodder and a generous place to shelter from storms or other weather, I built a small roadside shrine at the edge of the shelter with a stone canopy. Then I consecrated it to the mother. To keep the shrines from being defaced or destroyed, I cast a repair and strengthen spell on them. Creating and dedicating them sapped my energy, but not my willpower. In this way, an artery of the mother's influence spread from the temple in Bucharest to Sofia in the south, then east to Istanbul and Ankara. I sat on a headstone east of town, contemplating my route. I had a mountain range to traverse before I saw Antioch. I had taken to traveling with what I called a fascine knife, or what was called in current times a farmer's hook. I harvested grasses for the mules and kept bundles on their pack saddles. By the subtle use of a spell, they remained fresh and attractive to the beasts. When I became low on fodder in inhospitable places, I simply duplicated several bundles. Good campgrounds were few and far between, yet I did my best to improve what I could find, in each place bringing forth a spring for water and asking the mother's grace to bring fodder. Then I called up clean white stone to make a shrine and spent a day consecrating it. Thus it took over a season to bring me to the plains of Antioch and the great river that ran near it. As I sat on my heels looking at the green below, I asked, "What do you think, Mother?" "I think that a new temple to bless the fields would be appropriate." I felt a rush of energy, as if to say, "All right, you've rested. Now get off your ass and get busy." I smiled and started down the trail. I took a room after bedding down the mules. The dinner they served was vegetarian, but spicy. I found it edible, but it wouldn't be a favorite of mine. First I needed funds. Then I had to find and secure the land for the temple. Then I had to hire builders to quarry, transport, and lay the stone. That was how the mother wanted it done, so that was how it was to be. Like many other city-states, coins minted elsewhere were viewed with disfavor and given a lesser value, even if the metal making them up was of higher grade and weight. It was parochialism at its finest. I rented a large cart that was built strong enough to carry stone and bought enough chests to cover it. I convinced all 4 of my mules to bear it some distance between the city and the high hills. At dawn, when few observers would be about, I called for lost or misplaced silver from the city, hills, and all places between them. I felt as if many of the coins that appeared came from crypts and reliquaries deep in the caves of the hills. Many were blackened and corroded. A simple repair and strengthen made them look like new. I recognized some as coming from an age-long past when the Romans put their stamp on the lands. I estimated that I gained perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 silver coins. I closed the chests and guided my now protesting mules back to the city. We drove up to the office of the city clerk where I secured the team. After taking a chest, I cast a true spell, not a seeming, that would give anyone that touched the wagon, its contents, or the team a severe burn. Within I found the land office where I located a nice plot between the river and the fields. I wrote down its corner numbers before standing in line to wait for a clerk. The line soon shortened, and it was my turn. I adopted a pleasant face and made it known that I wished to purchase a bit of land. I slipped him a couple silvers to gain his cooperation. He started filling out forms, writing in a fair hand. I took up each one to check as he worked. I found that he had decided to rent the property to me for 2 years, and all improvements would go back to the owner. I punched the counter and thundered out, "Deceptive worm. This is a 2-year lease. I requested a purchase contract for the land. Correct this, lest you learn at your peril whom you are dealing with." He blanched for a moment, then tore up the documents he had been working on and reached for another pile. I noticed a guard, perhaps a captain because of the finery, enter the office to stand near the doorway. The contract completed, the clerk turned to me once again. "The cost of the land is 1,200 denarii. The city tax and registration fee is 120 denarii. I raised my eyebrow at what seemed to be a usuriously high processing cost, then opened the chest and started stacking piles of silver coins. The clerk started, then said, "I cannot accept the face value of these coins. They are obviously counterfeit and worth perhaps 1/4 of their face value." That did it. I cranked up the volume and dropped my seeming, appearing to grow by 8 inches and 100 or more pounds of muscle. "Useless dog. These are minted coins of this realm, many cast centuries before your worthless ass was born. In return for your swinish greed, I have a gift for you." I cast a series of spells. His face grew a piggy snout sporting piggy ears. He developed piggy eyes and piggy fangs. His fingers fused into piggy hooves. I completed the spell, and he dropped to all 4s, squealing and running out the door as fast as his piggy ass could run. I'll bet he's in someone's cooking pot by tonight. Next clerk. After that exhibition, I had no difficulty getting my deed signed, sealed, and filed. The captain sauntered after me as I carried my now lighter chest out the door. Some poor fool had tried to rob me. He ignored the stinging sensation and earned himself 2 hands burned into useless clubs. He lay on the ground rocking and weeping in pain. I canceled the defensive spell and put the chest back in the bed of the cart. Then I squatted down on my heels next to him. "I am willing to heal you if you promise me something in return." He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Anything. Anything, just give me my hands back. You may as well kill me as take my hands. It would be a more merciful death than starving or dying from the rot." I sat up a bit. "I shall ask for no more than you are willing to give. In return for healing you, I require 5 years of your life as a temple guard and farmer. A new temple dedicated to life and growth will be built soon, near the road just across the river. Do you agree?" His eyes lit with hope. "Yes, I agree. So be it. In the name of the mother, I heal you." I put my hands on his shoulders and let the energy slowly flow through him. Old broken bones straightened, lesions healed, his teeth became as new, and the worms destroying his eyes disappeared while their damage was reversed. He straightened out and relaxed, not hurting in some fashion for the first time in years. Then he noticed me watching him and quickly stood up. He went to one knee with a bowed head. "Master, I thank you. I am yours." I shook my head and raised him up. "Man, look me in the eye. I am a warrior priest of the mother, for whom you are now an acolyte. I fished out a handful of silver and handed it to him. Dress yourself well, buy equipment as if for the road, and make camp just to the left of the road across the river. Tomorrow we shall mark out the temple boundaries and begin sanctifying it. Then we will need to find builders, masons. He gave me a broad smile. I know of all the builders in the city. I can guide you, Sir Priest. I grinned wryly. I carry no titles as I deserve none. Call me by my given name, Simon. He nodded furiously and walked away with a bounce in his step. I remembered the guard captain as he said behind me, "You'll be lucky to see him again. He's a repeat criminal." I smiled at him. Somehow the mother touches whomever she wants. It leaves a sign that I can see. He's hers now. I clapped him on the shoulder. Come, let's find a place with good wine. I'll buy? I'm sure that you have several questions to ask me which your superiors will demand answers. He showed me a low stone tavern that promised to remain cool during scorching summer afternoons. He ordered a bottle that had the barkeep scrambling for his cellar to find. We filled our glasses and tapped them in a toast. He said, "To peace." I replied, "To balance." His eyebrow raised, but accepted the sentiment and sipped with me. He had found the good stuff. It was strong, too. I asked for a pitcher of water and said, "A bottle of this would make me very happy and very drunk." He replied, "Yup, and the good thing is it won't give you much of the wine flu afterwards. It's pricey, though, usually out of my budget." My thanks. We got down to the questions. Are you human? Yes. Do you intend evil or retribution to this city or any within it? Not unless provoked. He nodded at the limitation. You claim to be a warrior priest of the mother. Can you prove your magnification? I shrugged, closed my eyes and settled myself. With a calming breath, I whispered a prayer, asking that the mother show her blessing. I felt sunshine across my skin and smelled the spicy, pervasive smells of a forest glade just after a rain. I opened my eyes and smiled. Everything around me was glowing dark green. The table had put down roots and was covered with stems and leaves. My chair had grown to cradle me in vines and leaves. The top of the table was covered in damp moss. I took a sip of my wine and put it back down. I smiled at the befuddled officer. Yes, touch it. Make certain of its reality and that it is not a seeming. He ran his hand over the moss, then pinched off a bit and tasted it. Then he bent down and sniffed where he had pinched. He sat back up and nodded. I am convinced. I shall ask the mother to reverse her changes which otherwise would wither and die in this place. After a brief prayer of thanks, I asked that the balance be restored. I felt a glow all over me, knowing then that I had done the right thing. I opened my eyes to a more normal scene. He was staring at me. Your eyes and skin are dark green now. I shrugged. Depending on how I please the mother, some blessings are more visible and longer lasting than others. He shook his head and left. I smiled and settled back to finish the bottle. I ordered 2 more bottles and paid for it all before I left. If the mother approved, it would make a very nice offertory wine for the temple. I'd have to find the vintner to buy it by the barrel so as not to cheat him out of his labors. I dealt with the hostler for secure storage for my new wagon and wealth, then locked it all away, took the harnesses off of the mules and brushed them down while making much of them. They had performed wonderfully for me that day. I made them know that I appreciated it. There was nothing worse than a horse or mule that felt sorry for itself. I was still a bit tipsy as I returned to my rented room. I curled my lip with my hands on my hips. I could do better than this and still not make the owner panic. I cast repair and strengthen over the entire room walls, floor and ceiling, as well as the contents. I made the glass into clear panes and sealed up gaps where they shouldn't be any. The door became a 4-inch thick slab of cured oak with hinges that would secure a barn door. I didn't fool with the latch much because what I would have done would definitely be beyond the local technology. A Schlage deadbolt would have been beyond the pale. I sufficed with a nice, thick double crossbar for the door and the window. I summoned a thunder mug, a pitcher of water and a glass for later, then sent up a most satisfied thanks to the lady and fell asleep. I was more than a bit dry-mouthed in the morning. I presumed that I had drunk a reinforced vintage, one that had alcohol added to it, been dosed with brandy, or was an ice wine, a wine that was frozen and the plates of ice removed to fortify the remaining liquid. After dressing, relieving myself, and eating a pastry for breakfast, I returned to the tavern that I'd been in the previous day to learn where that wine came from. At first, the innkeeper wanted to be the middleman. He was an old trader and knew a good thing when he saw it. However, I insisted, telling him that I would be purchasing it by the barrel for the temple. I slipped him a gold for the information, which brightened up his day considerably. He hadn't seen a gold since he retired from the road, several years before. He looked pretty beat up and bent over from a long, hard life. I knew that I couldn't help everybody, but when the mood struck me or commanded by the lady, I could give aid. I had him sit down, then stood behind him with my hands on his shoulders. I breathed life and recovery into him. I didn't make him any younger, but I sure made his last decades more enjoyable. Lester became a cheerful source of information for me during the coming months and years. Dental, my thief-turned-acolyte, was where I expected. We explored the property lines, finding the markers. I replaced the small stone pyramids with 4-foot obelisks driven deeply into the ground. Then I walked the property line chanting all the way. When I finished, I had enough energy left to lay out my skins, chew a bit of jerky, and drop. Mother, this blessing and dedication stuff is hard work. I need a bigger battery. Come morning, I rose, made water, and did it all again. It took 4 days and 4 passes to complete the dedication. Dental was my camp keeper, cooking and taking care of the animals as I worked myself insensible. After resting, I saw my next task to be building a place for Dental and myself to live on the site. It had been consecrated to the mother and could not be left unoccupied to be sullied by the ignorant or the hostile. I used a form of farsight to look for a stone quarry. I looked in wider and wider circles until I found an open pit quarry, quite old and disused, deep in the desert, almost filled in by the sands. I called stones larger than I was. Some were buried as foundation work. Some helped form a huge break at the shoreline to stop erosion and troubles in times of flooding. Some floored over a large courtyard between the river and where the rear of the temple would lay. The floor of the plaza lay perhaps a foot higher than the high water marks I observed on the trees. I carved bollards to hold ropes so that small ships could tie up on the river. I caused to be built a half-sized copy of the temple in Bucharest as a quiet place to contemplate the mother away from where the main temple would be built. The smaller temple was given 4 side rooms, which would make admirable, if spare, sleeping quarters. All the fireplaces led to a common flue that the offertory bowl in the main temple also used. In one room, I formed a small kitchen with a table heavy enough at which to both work and eat. A swing-arm fireplace was a bit advanced for the culture, but I figured that it could easily be accepted and adopted. The same with a Dutch oven that could be used to cook pies and other baked goods. I'd seen beehive ovens in my travels, so one went up next to the kitchen and covered over to protect the clay from rains. Rather than put copies of my panniers on the ground where insects and rodents could easily make their homes, I hung them on pegs at least a foot off the ground. I copied the improved chairs, bed, table, and nightstand from my rented room for each of the bedrooms. Then I ran up against the idea of theft by loss of service. I bought many mule loads of firewood. There was local access to sugar and mustard seed. I bought covered crocks and vinegar, then cucumbers to make pickles and cabbage to make coleslaw. I realized something was missing with my coleslaw and couldn't figure it out until I hit on celery seed. It made stews more savory as well. We had to buy wood tubs and grain, as only a madman would drink the water. Everyone except the wealthy drank small beer day and night. The wealthy drank mead or wine. Even watered wine wouldn't kill you or make you sick as long as you replaced 1/3 of the volume with wine. I doubled the thickness of the roof and walls of the room that we turned into our brewery and blocked the windows. We wanted it cool and still, year-round. I marked the foundation lines of the new temple and sketched out what I wanted on a rough sheet of papyrus. I don't think they'd ever seen a measure drawing before, and it made a big hit. The builders could make much better estimates as to the amount of stone, timbers, and roofing material which they'd need. Dental had a partner whose legs had been crushed and one arm twisted. I had him bring the man out to the temple. After I healed Ilas, he turned into a big, strapping lad with curly black hair, an easy grin, and the muscles of a blacksmith. He too swore an oath of obedience to the mother. I sent the 2 of them off with pockets full of silvers and finger of gold to the vintner I'd been told of for 4 barrels of his good wine. They rode new mules and had instructions to purchase a cart to haul the wine back after bedding the barrels in deep beds of straw. Each man was given a steel falchion and a buckler, weapons well beyond state-of-the-art at the time, and both got my laying on of hands treatment to learn how to use them. The vintner was over 100 miles away by seacoast to the south. He made his home in Lebanon. I estimated a bit less than 200 miles for the journey. They would be following the coast, but some of their path was mountainous and some was contested. I began laying out stacks of silver to mine, transport, and lay all that stone. The temple was to be 180 feet long. The central nave and sanctuary were to be 60 by 60 feet with 18-foot tall walls. That would give us 2 rooms to either side of the main temple for classrooms and eating, or even sleeping for any claiming sanctuary. 2 long low buildings close to our mini temple were to be used for farmers, and perhaps we could raise goats and chickens for milk, eggs, and meat. I had yet to survey the fields with an eye towards irrigation and flood prevention. It was past the traditional time to plow and plant a garden or a field, but the season there was long and hot. I had some seed in my pack, but not enough for the size of the vegetable garden I envisioned needing. By the grace of the mother, more sprouts started coming up than I had planted. I sent a laborer to town with some silver to quickly purchase gardening hose and water buckets. The second and third sons of farmers soon came seeking food and shelter. They were happily surprised to earn coppers as well. I received permission to do a rush job on the housing to give them places to stay. The row housing didn't look like much to me, but the stone walls and heavy ceilings seemed palatial to them, used to living in soddies half dug out of the ground. I had to disperse salt, flour, preserved meat, and vegetables the first season. We had 3 chicken coops started after the first month. Every household was given a bucket, a large and a small pot, spoons and knives, blankets, a table, chairs, and a raised bed with a mattress. I went on a weekly patrol through them, all healing wounds and watching for infection and diseases. When it got cooler and the storms came, I supplied shutters and doors, then overhangs over the windows and doorways. I tried to watch over them, for they were my responsibility. However, I knew that I couldn't coddle them lest they be spoiled. I spent many hours thinking of how to strike a balance. I prayed for ideas. Without my intervention, a warm spring came up in a broad, shallow pool, which emptied into the river. It gave the people a place to bathe, get their clean water for drinking and cooking, as well as wash their clothing. Once a month, we held a hunt in the wooded hills for meat and skins. They knew how to make soap with hardwood ashes, and I provided fired clay fat lamps, needles, and thread as holiday gifts. When the temperatures got down to the low 40s at night, I tacked sheets of waxed parchment over the windows with lath strips and tacks. It made it darker inside, but much warmer. The mother provided grapes and oranges at the weekly feasts. The children tended not to get sick. A room in the temple was set aside for a weekly potluck every 7th day, a concept which I admittedly introduced, much like a potluck, where tales were told, skills like flint knapping demonstrated, and everyone got to sit and gossip, including the kids. They knew how to make twine and rope and how to boil strips of hide from their kill for glue. I demonstrated a mat loom using the river reeds so that they could keep their feet off of the cold stones and make their beds warmer. I showed them the ATL, and soon contests were held. It made the hunters more prolific. It gave the older boys bragging rights too. Weaving nets is one of those simple things that you have to be shown the first time. They already knew how to make baskets, but not how to make twisted grass baskets which will hold water and can be cooked in with hot rocks. All these little skills gave them something to do at night besides breed or wait for the next day. Once the walls and roof of the bulk of the temple were finished, I paid off the laborers. Then I called up the oddly shaped stones necessary to construct a dome. As I had done before, the last handful of tiers were made of rose quartz, and the final locking stone was comprised of faceted quartz to bring in light. Late one night, after everyone had gone to their beds, I cast a repair and strengthen on the entire building. It took me 3 attempts to cover the entire structure, but when it was finished, I guaranteed that nobody would ever steal stones from it. They were all fused into one. Still breathing hard, I walked out onto the plaza and cast the spell again so that the stones would not shift under the stresses inflicted by the river and the seasons. Then our miniature temple received the same treatment. That was enough. I flopped down onto my pallet, still panting. I thanked the mother for the chance to demonstrate my attention to her requests and prayed that what we had done fulfilled her expectations. The next day, I prepared myself and started the long, slow benediction of prayers and chants to consecrate the temple and further bless its grounds. Rather than attempt to finish it all in 1 or 2 days, I took my time, finishing the last benediction on the 14th evening. I finally said, "In the Mother's name, let it be." All that slowly developed power flashed out in a wave from the corner posts to the center of the temple sanctuary and back out again. I smiled, brought out my last gold cup and sat it on the sanctuary altar and watched it fill with water. I took a sip, then offered it to each of the farmers and their wives that had come to witness the end of the ritual. When it came back to my hand, it was still full. I brought a little fat lamp and wick out of my satchel. The wick became moist and a pool of oil formed in the bottom. I struck a spark and lit it. I felt something in my satchel that didn't belong. It was a crude copper dish that had a bright tin lining. I placed it on the altar. Parched cracked grain sprinkled down to form a pile, mostly filling it. I smiled and spoke to the others. Here is proof of the mother's promise. Place a pinch of grain within your lower lip and take a sip of water. You will not hunger or thirst. The mother shows that no matter what else happens, she will do her best to keep her followers from starving. I sat on the steps and continued. You must do your part. You must tend the fields, harvest the food, and put it up. But here, under the mother's care, the promise is made that you will not go hungry. Despite drought, you will not go without water. With assured food, your children will grow tall and straight. There will be a place for you here as you find yourselves too old to work the fields, and food will still be here for you. Those that take of the grain and water are her celebrants, and I welcome you to the service and protection of the mother. I shakily made my way back to my furs. I laid myself down and stared at the ceiling. It is finished. Your first great temple of this age is complete, and already men and women have come under your aegis. Now we wait for the other shoe to drop from the indignant mullahs, rabbis, and priests. I rolled over and went to sleep, dreaming shadows of combat to come. In the morning, a new hay barn stood proud in the morning light, the mow filled with bundles of hay and clover. The animal barn stood not far from it, the stalls and mangers standing clean and open waiting for the mules and cows. Beside it was an overhanging roof to shield the carts and wagons. A rocked-in pit lay empty at the rear, ready for the straw and manure to turn into fertilizer for the fields. A stone spring house sat over a new spring-fed rivulet of cold water, ready to hold the cans of milk and jars of butter to keep them sweet in the heat of the summer. There were many new things here, many concepts unknown to this place and time. I saw wheelbarrows, scythes, and milk cans. I hadn't seen a butter churn, but I was sure there was one or two around somewhere. Perhaps even a cheese house. The concepts demonstrated here would make the temple farm a showplace and turn local farming practices on their communal ears. All we needed now was a horse-drawn plow and contour plowing to really set the fox among the hens. I wondered at why all this suddenly appeared. I thought about the calendar, then looked to the sun. Of course, it was one of her high holy days. The longest day, the shortest day, and the equinoxes. Oh, the planting moon and harvest moon were big competitors, but they changed with the calendar. The big four depended on the planet's orbit of the sun and never changed. I must have been pushed to complete the temple project and its dedication without knowing it. The guiding hand, and all that. I shrugged. Somebody's got to drive the car, and I didn't have the mojo for a license. I went into town to try to find a couple milk cows, either bred or freshened. It would be good to have milk for the kids, though. I didn't waste my breath. I walked through the market, letting the people know that we wanted milk cows, bundles of wheat straw for bedding, and grain in sacks. I said my hellos to people I knew and walked back home. Our travelers had returned. They had the barrels of wine plus a few gallon bottles of a raisin honey wine that the vintner had been working on. We welcomed everyone home and had a party for them that night to listen to their tales of the road. Being the curious fellow I pulled the cork from one of the gallon jugs and gave it a cautious sniff. The vapors coming off of the warm liquor made my eyes water. The guy had invented distillation and sent along 4 gallons of a very strong brandy. From a sip, I figured out that it had started out as a too-sweet Porto that had undergone a second, more complete fermentation. Knowing what grew around there, I'd have to turn him on to starting with a sour plum wine that was good for nothing else, but in Poland was used for making slivovitz, which would likewise put hair on your chest. And on your teeth. I wondered if he had an excess of potatoes. Polish white spirits, triple distilled vodka. I'd have to show him charcoal filtering too, or the stuff could be lethal. I put the stuff away for the shortest day celebration. Once we had made barrel stands, the men used canvas slings to move the heavy barrels into the fermentation room. Then I borrowed the cart and team for a few days. First, I cast a very strong repair and strengthen on the cart. Each morning, I went out with an empty cart and a few coins in my pocket. Each afternoon, I returned with a heavy cart. I'd mentally broken the city into boroughs. In each one, I stopped for lunch. Then before leaving for the temple, I quietly cast a finding spell for lost gold, then one for lost silver. The high sides of the reinforced cart held all the weight, and a canvas cover kept curious eyes away. One of the unused bedrooms off of the small temple became our treasury. The windows disappeared and grew into walls, and the door became a massive pivoting stone block with an axle running through the center. By the time I finished, it wasn't easy to find or to open. Coppers? I kept a trunk filled with coppers and a dusting of silver coins at the foot of my bed. This was the obvious or public treasury. I found myself feeling sad. I knew that I had to leave, yet there were many things incomplete. I took a deep breath and bowed my head. I had to trust the mother that if it needed to be done, it would be done. Atlas had a good place to live out his days there on the temple farm. I would go on alone. I lightened my pack with smaller jars and containers of whatever I needed. The only thing I kept in its original size was my waxed canvas herb collection. I had a feeling that I'd be expanding and using that. I felt that I no longer needed my spear or ATL. My hunting or fighting was done with small stones, copper coins, or even whatever I found. I stood at an intersection of roads just outside of town, waiting to be told my next direction of travel. I knew better than to think rather of my next destination because the events that drove me were so fluid. The analogy of a leaf in a stream caught my imagination, and I smiled. I walked to the side of the road and sat down, Caesar, in order to fall into a light zazen trance. This quickly became a mantra to the mother. I could feel the smile on my face as I relaxed, waiting for direction. As nightfall came upon me, I gained no instruction. I concluded that this was to be my call. I brought up a memory of a map of the world. Perhaps northern India. The mountainous regions to the north, which later would become the stands, were truly formidable and virtually unpopulated except for goat herds and those that had run away from things bad enough to chase them to such a brutal environment. Still, I recalled the presence of many large distributed caves that entire villages could shelter in and thrive. Their only lack was for arable land to farm. Food had to be obtained somehow, and that source traditionally had been raiding. Perhaps the hand of the mother might gain a hold there and make some of the hidden valleys fruitful. It was a possible path among many. Some of the great Pan-Asian trade routes had Antioch as one terminus. It was simple to follow the trail northeast through the river valleys among the mountains to Malaya. It was fall, the harvest season. I will always remember that city for the scents and tastes of the luscious apricots grown there by the tens of thousands. From there I followed the rich Euphrates Valley east to what would perhaps be Armenia. In Yerevan I grew tired of walking. My sandals gave out on the trail, which vexed me to no end. I purchased a pair of sturdy low bull-hide boots there and investigated what steeds were on the market. I was bemused to find more camels than any other beast. I decided to investigate whether or not I could form a bond with these odd-looking animals. One morning, just after sunrise, I sat down with my back to a pole, making up a stableman's paddock. I had my pack with me and my usual 2-gallon water bags. I also had a bag of fresh pitted apricots the size of my head. It had been quite a while since I'd spoken the Talks to Animals spell. I had to think a moment to recall all of its little details. I cast it with a bit of camel hair in my hand, inhaling the scent of the huge beasts behind me. They were smarter than I had thought. It was no wonder that they had a reputation for copying an attitude. A few came over to see what I was about. I introduced myself, telling them that I was going to travel far south. I needed a sturdy steed to bear me and 1 or 2 pack beasts, if for no other reason than to give them some company so life on the trail would not make them feel so alone. One young male sniffed at me. I smell stone fruit. I wonder if he would share? I stealthily filled my hand with fresh apricot halves and held them out behind me, through the fence. I felt velvety lips gently take them from me. He listened. This one listens. Several camels lay down close to me across the fence, and the interrogation began. Yes, I carried grain for my animals, and sweet grass too, for barren campgrounds. I noted that I could summon water from nearly anywhere, as I was a warrior priest of the mother. I was surprised that they understood my meaning. It was nearly noon when I stood. 3 camels stood as well. We ambled over to the stable master. Greetings, man. He replied, may Allah hold you close. Oh, Islamic Turks. I replied, Inshallah, or as God wills. I seem to have become attached to these 3 beasts. I am bound to a long trail and find myself in need of both a steed and beasts to carry my goods. These are the finest of my herd. He looked at me curiously. Though as a businessman taking as much of your money as I can is my fondest hope, I must ask if you know what you are doing? I smiled at his distress. He didn't want his animals mistreated. I felt better about dealing with the man. I motioned to the camels. One put his head over my shoulder while the 2 females lay down beside me. I believe we have a working relationship already. I do not use the stick. I never have, or will have to in the future. I scratched the big fellow behind his ear, taking what would have been a very risky liberty with a huge male camel. He nibbled my ear, then set his head back down on my shoulder to look at the stable master. The man rubbed over his ear, hardly believing what his eyes told him. He shrugged. Inshallah, it is out of my hands. He cocked his head and thought about how much he could get from me. I gently chastised him. Don't think so hard. I smell smoke. He grinned a bit. 170 silvers each. He had the temerity to look as if he were going to battle with that price. I slipped a hand within my robes and silently called for lost silver in the area, enough to fill my hand. The mother must have been feeling either generous or tickled that day as my hand almost hit the ground. I withdrew my hand holding a 50-pound ingot of silver half covered in proof stamps. Can you make change? A trip to the jeweler's market got me a nice ruby necklace and a handful of gold coins. Every man I saw boasted a saber at his side. On the way back to the stable and stockyards, I spotted an armorer's storefront. The stable master was patient enough to wait while I made a couple of selections. I carefully went over his stock. Some was old, some new. Most was damaged, though some appeared to be modern military quality or better. I spotted 3 blades that had no business being there. There, hanging on the wall, was a match pair of ring-handled Chinese war swords and a weight-forward heavy sword that was the length of a short sword and had a heavy guard boasting heavy forward-pointing pins. It was a type of sword breaker. I bought all 3, though he charged me extra for the leather sheaths. I had to find a shoulder harness and belt to hold their weight comfortably and out of the way. I felt better after that, less of a walking target. My companion eyed my purchases and grunted. Formidable. If you can swing them and have some speed in your arm, there aren't many on the trails that would try you. Instead, they'd stand off and shoot you full of arrows, he laughed. I didn't. He was right. I'd have to work on a shield with the aid of the mother. Back at the corral, I sought out a training pole at the rear of his building. It was where prospective guards were observed while attacking a fixed target. I cast a strong repair and strengthened into my new blades, then shook out my shoulders, drew the swords, and attacked. I used rising and falling strokes, shaving large slivers off of the pole until I gave a hard backhand slash, and the top half toppled to the ground. The stable master walked over to inspect his fighting pole. After bending down to look at it closely, he said, "I'm not even angry. I'm just amazed." I grinned and sheathed my new weapons. I'd left my pack with the camels while dealing with the jewelers. I reclaimed it while giving the three of them a scratch on the head. "You shall be here just one more night. I'll make sure you get buckets of water and good mash to eat for dinner along with a little fresh fruit or some sweet dates." I patted all three, then left to find the bazaar. It was easy to find, really. All I had to do was listen. I bought a light-colored hooded robe much like a jalaba, but made of a heavier, stiffer cloth like a light canvas. It would serve as my outer garment until the trail got cold enough for my fur cloak. I stocked up on some preserved meat, preserved and fresh fruit, as well as some vegetables. It was the wrong end of the Silk Road to find inexpensive spices. Rather, I sold some of my black pepper, cloves, and nutmeg. The dealers were happy to have them, even though the quantities were small, as no caravans had come through in over half a year. That piqued my interest. Traders had no reason to put off selling to their markets for so long. That meant interference. It would be something for me to watch. I returned to the paddock where I made up buckets of grain and warm water, each topped with a handful of chopped sweet dates for my beasts. I said my praise and gave thanks, then settled down to sleep. The camels bedded down to sleep just across the fence from me. I should have expected it. After the moon rose, I heard one of the camels snort, then bellow. 3 men were creeping up on my camp. Some busybody had seen me at the jeweler's. I shrugged. Too bad for them. It was a bad night for clumsy thieves. Each one of them rose 50 feet into the night air and fell, shrieking, to the ground like wet sacks of cement. They were still there in the morning. I spoke with the mother as to what form a saddle should take to be the most comfortable for a camel. Light, airy, supportive yet not applying pressure on the spine. We came up with something like a McClellan saddle with a hole in the middle. It flexed to fit the animal but, like the McClellan, was a pain in the ass for the rider. A couple small rugs folded over the top changed my seat dramatically. A modified buck frame pack saddle fit the females well enough to keep them from complaining. I made them bright red to ease the ladies' vanity. The trail took me southeast. I followed the great river valleys to Mazel and Baghdad. Grasses and bushes were everywhere. I spent some time while riding weaving small casting nets as I rode. When we stopped for the day, I tested one of my contraptions. I cut a springy pole with a Y at the small end. As I walked towards some brush, I poised the pole with one edge of the net caught in the end of the pole. When I flushed a bird, I threw the net with a snap. It opened up properly, but my aim was off. For more attempts schooled my arm to match my eye. I netted a nice, fat bird for dinner. There's no way I've found to clean a bird that isn't messy. Still, once the feathers are gone and the thing's butterflied, a few good tree suckers or bush suckers like diamond willow scrub will make a nice cage to hold it open over the fire. The juices coming from deep in the meat tend to keep the wood supports from burning. It had grown up being one of 4 large cities at the junction of 2 trade routes. If you wanted anything, it could be had there, for a price. Well, usually. Everyone was complaining that the trade routes had dried up to nothing. When I heard that, I decided to make some people's day. Since there was an unusual scarcity, I was allowed to duplicate some things I carried. My always fresh panniers gave me a benefit unheard of in that day and age. I created bushels of dried apples, kegs of white flour, bushels of fresh apricot halves, pounds of black pepper, fresh hands of ginger, pounds of cloves, as well as 200 steel needles, 80-gallon jugs of a really mean doubly distilled brandy, and 20 gallons of the vintner's excellent reinforced port wine. In return, I received 2 quarts of top-quality honey in sealed glass jars, the jars being worth more than the honey. Some small woods knives, several very nice gemstones, and a treatise on mathematics and astronomy, which in those times was worth 10 times its weight in gold. Anything else I could have traded for would simply lose value as I traveled. I stopped by the shop of a blacksmith noted for having a delicate hand. There I drew out for him a pair of scissors. He didn't say a flippin' word. He just stood there staring at that diagram. I think that it was something of a religious experience for him. I wondered if I should lay the idea of a hemostat on someone or bent needles for suturing. If I saw anyone doing engraving, then I'd know that they had enough of a handle on steel recipes and hardening to cope with it. Before I left the blacksmith shop, I motioned his wife to come over to me. I told her, make a square, flat dish with straight sides out of good clay. Fire it hard. Make a tight-fitting lid for it. Fire that hard as well. Put finished knife blades in it along with crushed charcoal. Prop the blades up so that the edges touch nothing. Cover the dish and pack the edge with clay. Now heat the whole thing dull red for an entire day, or even longer. Then allow it to cool and open it. The blades should be dark colored from the smoke, but they also will have taken in some of the smoke into the metal, making the edges harder. Strop them sharp and try them. There. I just introduced case hardening. I smiled and left, having done enough good deeds for the day. The mother lightly chastised me during my sleep that night, but did it in a kindly way. They already had what steel, so razor-sharp weapons such as axes and sabers were not military secrets, just more expensive than almost anyone could afford. Case hardening would bring sharper, better steel edges to the lower classes. It would make for better tools, saws, chisels, needles, and knives. It would make people's lives easier if they used a little ingenuity. Hell, treating axles and races for wheels as well as block and tackle would help tremendously. I hadn't introduced the nut and bolt for God's sake. Now that was an industrial kick in the ass. So was electro-welding, which I probably could have come up with after fooling about with some good copper wire, a few magnets, and a flume. Hell, even a water wheel and a belt drive. Nope. Mama wouldn't be happy, and if Mama ain't happy, you know the rest. I thought about several inventions that would form the basis for trade goods that people would desire enough to further drive trade. If it was expensive to obtain by trade caravan, perhaps it would spawn a renaissance in shipbuilding. Heavy narrow keels, rope making, sail making, harvesting masts, shiplap construction versus clinker built, there was a lot there. Some the mother wouldn't mind, but some, like the deforestation to build hulls and harvest masts, would piss her off tremendously. I didn't even want to disappoint her as she'd given so much to me and my kind, so selflessly. It didn't seem right to do it. Then I had a brain fart. Catamarans. Trimarans. Almost nothing beneath the surface. No boards used except for a small cabin above the deck. It had the possibility of turning around the entire ship-building ecological equation. If nice, fast-growing bamboo could be harvested for the deck and masts, then that portion of the ecological cost would drop as well. Now, if only we could find somewhere that they were growing fields of flax to make linen and hemp for rope. I hoped that cotton would be a dead-end technology in that world. It almost demanded slave labor to be productive. Flax, however, grew like wheat. Even though it takes more steps to get the thread ready to spin. I attempted a guided dream in which I explained the difference. I woke up with a hard-on and an all-body glow. The mother was happy with me. I found myself singing One Love by Bob Marley all morning. It's hard to shake a happy buzz like that. Now I had to figure out where to introduce the concepts. Surat on the western coast of India seemed like a good candidate. I could teach how to create high-temperature bone china. The flax process had been known by man for tens of thousands of years. A few tricks like spinning wheels and whipcord cloth for sail-making on top of trimaran hulls would get the mariners zoom-in and boom-in across the deeps. The coming of the traders would spark building of ports and warehouses. Only the mother had the vision to see where it would go from there. The caravan routes funneled down to a long stretch south of Baghdad to Kuwait. I kept my eyes open and tried to look distracted in case a lookout spotted me. The mother came up with a shield for me. It wasn't a physical shield, per se, as a seeming. It was an illusion that made me and my animals appear in a blur, so we were almost impossible to hit with a bow. We were passing through a valley when a flight of arrows seemed to hit everything but us. I tossed a handful of coppers into the air where they circled above my head. As I detected our hunters with my mage sight, a copper coin snapped through the air with a whip crack to embed itself in a forehead. If there had been an observer that lived, they would have seen what looked like a flight of copper bees that circled for a moment, then disappeared with a crack of lightning not once or twice, but 4 times. I found that I could handle about 12 at a time. Not far down the trail, I found a path leading up into the rocks where the ambush had occurred. Some were young, most were older, and some were ancient. Those I searched. I followed the paths and the stones back to a set of caves. Some women were being held as slaves. Their culture did not allow me to free them. I could either claim them or kill them. I chose the first solution. I was certain that they'd rather work for a temple farm than die. The goods from several caravans were tucked away, and a few of their animals had not been eaten yet. The mother took pity on me and blessed me with a strange spell. It made a pack that would fit on my back or fit in a single slim pannier, but would contain everything that would fit in a warehouse. I used that spell to make a case with a 3-foot opening and strip the campsite of anything usable, including the gelt from the caravans. Anything that I couldn't pack away was abandoned, other than the animals and women. There were no youths or children. They had all been murdered. I did the fishes and loaves thing to keep everyone fed as we made our way down the trail. Finally, we sighted Kuwait City. The traders were part of a clan and took in the few survivors I managed to bring down the trail. I kept silent, but the women spoke of seeing the bandits lying dead with coins buried in their heads. I found a local temple to the mother where I stayed and kept myself in seclusion until I was ready to leave. I emptied my new super pack in the temple's courtyard for the priests to dispose of. I took one piece for mine, a thick wool carpet. I anticipated strange times ahead and wanted something that I could roll up in and sleep. After relaxing and laundering my robes, I sought out the shipmaking district. I found a dried-up little Turk sitting in the shade sipping coffee. All the other men seemed to defer to him in their arguments and contracts. I sat listening until I was noticed. Then I used a long reed to draw a single-masted trimaran. I talked about the benefits in using unriven lumber and no keel over the deeps. A simple deck could be made, or even netting used to support the cargo. It would take just as much sail and rope as a traditional ship, but since it did not have to cut through the water, it should travel much faster upon the wind. If they ran into trouble sailing against the wind, then dropping a keelboard should work. Some of the shipbuilders loudly called me a fool and a dreamer. The old man, however, offered me a coffee. We spoke of trade-offs, such as poor behavior in congested ports and being able to drive the vessel right up onto a beach without damage. He said, "You must have traveled many strange places to see things such as this." I replied, "The mother has taken me to places that 3 lifetimes would be required to see them." I dropped 3 fingers of gold in his hand to have one built and rigged. The younger men seemed disappointed that I wasn't just a dreamer, but I put my money where my mouth was. The Nile Valley had long been known for making top-quality sailcloth. The Greeks had been making rope since antiquity. The old man smiled when he found that it was an incredibly fast ship to build. I told him about the lands east of India where the giant grasses grew, called bamboo. A single stalk was too weak to use in the storms at sea, but several stalks bound and glued together under pressure was another animal. It grew almost impossibly fast as well. After several long nights of contemplation, I came to the conclusion that the mother did not begrudge mankind inventions or creations that did not cause evil, or rather detrimental impact upon the planet. I had seen nothing but painstakingly made carpets other than the most primitive matted hair or felt in my travels. In Baghdad, I bought as many used and abused felt blankets as I could for a silver. It was a pile that was almost as tall as I was. I sat in a corner of the market with my purchases and cut them into 1-inch strips. I had a couple strong needles and a large spool of strong thread that I would trust to bring in a decent fish. I started making braided rugs. I hummed and sang to myself as my hands mindlessly worked. I focused on making sleeping pads. First one, then another grandmother came to watch me. I smiled and showed them how to first stitch together the heads, then braid the lines, stitch on the extensions, and then use cut strands of the felt to weave the braids into rugs. A final stitch or 2 to finish things, and a nice, warm sleeping mat was finished in less than a day. I gave a few away to the grandmothers, receiving a nice hug and kiss from each. I knew that I'd just created a cottage industry that couldn't be stopped. It turned trash into usable products once more. Once the grandmothers started talking, only the mother could stop it. I went to bed that night very happy. The next day, I went to the market with some boards. I fashioned what looked like an open-topped sawhorse. I cut 10 slots from side to side across the top of the thing, then split large hanks of twine across them. I piled hands full of grasses, used up cloth, anything soft in the slot, then crisscrossed the cords and did it again. Slowly a mat formed between the legs of the horse, like some obscene belly. At the end of the day, I tied off the cords at the top and cut them off. I pulled out the thick mat that I had made, some 4 inches thick. If waxed or protected, it would make a wonderful sleeping mat for a trader in the mountains. If several were stitched together, a heavy garment could be formed, and if even more were used, an insulated tent. It was a variant on a Cherokee mat loom that I'd seen several lifetimes before. The next day, I appeared with a big bundle of reeds. I had the attention of most of the people there. Hardly any business was transacted near me. I started making a basket, but kept it broad and almost flat. I made a broad cone, wove a band through the edges, trimmed it up, and added a neck cord. It was a rainproof, stormproof hat that a Vietnamese peasant would be proud of. The next morning I appeared and just sat. People gathered together to see just what the hell I would come up with next. I did nothing but smile. Finally, a handsome, horse-faced woman came up to me. She said, "You come to us as a teacher, yet you have stopped teaching. Why? Because I need to learn what you need to know. Some things are easy to teach as all folk can use them. Others are difficult, as you must ask yourselves, is it worth knowing this? How can this be perverted? Are we willing to risk this? I can only teach it this time. I cannot judge. If on the other hand you wish me to judge, then I shall, but I fear that you will not like what happens once the floodgates open. In honesty, I tell you that I am a warrior priest of the mother." Her eyes opened like saucers and her hand covered her mouth. She scrabbled backwards and fled the courtyard. Many followed her to learn what she had discovered. Every morning, I faithfully came to sit in the market square. None came to speak to me. This lasted for weeks. Finally, a young man came to me. Teach me. There must be a better way. Ah, a student. Come, sit with me. I started with the simple things. I used the Greek Socratic method. I asked questions and let him learn from his answers and my visions of how his answers might reflect on reality. I had the benefit of the mother's vision. We danced Tai Chi in the mornings and ran afterwards. The mother judged him as acceptable. He was shown a ghost of the runic spell language structure by the mother. I taught him how to call light, call heat, and dismiss fire. That alone made him a powerful shaman. I began to teach him how to speak in runic. The world began to open before his eyes. He discovered the talk to animals on his own. I had never gone to the lengths of looking for a familiar. He returned from a desert walk with a spotted short-tailed cat weaving itself between his legs. I reminded him that all contracts went in both directions. He solemnly nodded. I hoped that he just didn't give lip service to the words. Only time and the mother's gaze would tell. I called forgotten wealth and poured his hands full of coins to fund a temple. He knew what was demanded of him from his dreams of the mother. We found a place and bought the property. I helped him build the primary temple and consecrate the land before I left. I left the camels with him as I knew he would care for them properly. Once he knew the paean to the mother, I knew that I could do no more but let him find his own wings. I journeyed back to Kuwait City and waited. The trimaran was ready. I contracted and paid for a captain, crew, trader, and cook. The thing looked impossibly huge at first glance, over 200 feet long and 50 feet wide. The reinforced mast was monstrous, as was the sail. The supplies necessary to operate that wretched thing made my butthole pucker more than once. However, having the food, water, spare rope, and a spare sail aboard were not a fancy, they were necessary. When I saw her at her sea trials, I asked, why is the foresail not being exercised here, where any problems can be addressed? They looked at me dumbly. I slapped my forehead. It was all my fault. My diagrams had never shown a foresail, and they had no experience with one. I contracted with the sail loft to quickly have one made in a 30-60-90 triangle with a belly, and had reefing straps sewn to reinforce strips sewn across all four sails. The running set as well as the storm sheets. The foot of the boom was mounted 7 feet above the deck to allow for short shelters where inventory could be kept out of the weather and sailors given a place out of the weather to relax, eat, and sleep. They already knew of net hammocks to sleep in. It was a sailor's test to fashion their own. As the ship's owner, I was excluded from this. But when 2 sailors came to my cabin near the wheelhouse, they found me almost finished with mine. I grinned at them and winked, leaving them curious as to what sort of man their owner was. Every other day, I called for lost coin and jewelry to come to me. The trading routes of the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea had been hotly contested by traders, countries, and pirates for centuries. The pilot and crew noticed the ship become more reluctant to answer the helm after we visited certain ports. Well, it was no wonder with all the coins I'd stowed in chests amidships. At least I was smart enough to keep the ship in trim. I let the captain, pilot, and trading proctor in on my secret, showing them the chests of coin harvested from the sea. The poor trader sank into a funk for a while. When I confronted him, he asked, "Why am I here? You already have gained a king's ransom without a single trade." I feel like a child watching impossible things, knowing that he will never be good enough to do them himself. Who? This was what the mother had warned me against. I presumed to solve the problem by setting a task against the captain, pilot, and trader. They were to trade for lighter weight wealth that would gain us even more for us when traded back in the lands near the Mediterranean Sea. I knew of a few things that the old craftsmen of India might be persuaded to sell us, but only if the mother approved. I thought to bring low-tech distance signaling through the use of mirrors and telescopes to these lands, where people felt isolated and the warlords reigned with impunity. Then perhaps I could remember enough about Fresnel lenses and lighthouses to do some good. If this world could be chivied into the future without the abuse of petrochemicals, I would feel vindicated in my life here. No planes, no jets, not even railroads or coal smoke, such as the fog of pollution that covered industrial London to the degree that it earned the nickname the smoke for centuries after. I attempted a lucid dream with the mother. I believed that an effective way to guide the use of a resource was to make it too expensive to abuse. If Tesla and Edison, Steinmetz and Maxwell had never been born or were steered to other fields of interest, the efficiencies of industrial electrical power would never come to be known. Deforestation was another man-fostered killer. If men could be taught to harvest wood in bands rather than clear-cutting, the deserts would have a much lower chance of reaching a tipping point where greenery in spring was but a faint memory to the grandfathers, or forgotten altogether. The cedars of Lebanon were remembered only in poem and song. The western islands of Great Britain were vast tracts of wasteland, sand, rock, and scrub, while any man with a shovel and the time could dig up evidence of great trees once covering those lands. When I woke, I realized that something had changed. I felt a new resolve, a new fervor. It sprang from the roots of every plant and drove every animal. The mother would no longer take such a succoring attitude towards humanity. It had been relegated to the status of just another animal that, if it overran its niche, would die back. I knew that unless we wanted to be caught up in a purge, we should do our business quickly in the giant cities of the Indian Basin and up into China, cities like Bombay, Ceylon, Madras, Calcutta, Bangkok, Singapore, Canton, and Manila. The land traders would find their routes much more dangerous after a season or two, which would ultimately make them more expensive. I believed that only the more economical traders would succeed in the coming times. The free ride was over. I thought about it almost constantly. Many insects were more numerous than man, yet they had their place in the ecology, as did the worms. Some grew too successful in times of plenty, such as the grass eaters. They either fell to the predators or starved to death in windrows at the first crop failure. I wondered how it would come upon us. I saw two avenues that would be simple for the mother to trigger. A deadly spring mold could spread spores. Everywhere that man was built up too densely, they would die. Another, less tailored catastrophe would be a simple crop failure. If the rains fell only at sea for a year, mankind would die back quickly to Stone Age population levels. I prayed for the mold, as dying of hunger brought much suffering. I prayed in the dark, night after night, as we sailed. I prayed for mercy for all of the human race. I woke one morning with a cough. I ached for a day and filled a bucket from both of my ends. Then I was fine if a couple pounds lighter. The crew promptly caught the same thing. The trading factor, the pilot, cook, and captain got it too. Afterwards, we thought nothing of it. Samuel, our trader, did his best to empty our chests of silver in the silk market, the gemstone markets, and trading for books. We bought the specialty spices of each area by the trunkful. I quietly cast preservation spells on all of our chests that had been set aside for provisions and spices. I told Samuel to purchase potted plants that bore fruits or plants and bushes that provided spices and might survive a sea voyage. I had to convince the crew not to mutiny by demonstrating my ability to duplicate full casks of sweet water so that the crew and the plants would both survive the voyage. In Ceylon, we sought out tea and cinnamon. Madras brought us cumin and hot peppers. In Bangkok, we purchased musical stringed instruments and many ground glass lenses. Singapore brought us something unlooked for yet of high value, a large book of plans for looms and wheels. I bought several hundredweight of the most difficult part to make the vertical steel wires with eyes in them, designed to move the threads up and down in various patterns. I bought several sizes to accommodate different yarns and even torn-apart blankets. I had one more port I wished to make, and that was Canton, China. They collected marvelous rugs for sale from many hundreds of miles away, some at the time being the most difficult to travel places in the world. Here I was generous in my purchases and spent much gold. I found something that I had been coveting throughout the voyage: lenses. Polished glass lenses the size of a child's palm. They were quite heavy compared to most of our stock, but I purchased as many as I could. I had a fine furniture maker create small chests for them with slots lined in velvet. I also purchased 2 large chests of small glass sheets that had been polished flat. My mirrors that I had dreamed of were now within my reach. I called to lost coin from the Great Bay and was impressed with what returned to our chests. Samuel looked, sighed, and smiled at me. I should be grateful to have such problems, yet you confound me. Priest, you make what has been the joy of my life nothing more than a pedestrian task. You are the very picture of the devil. I told him, my friend, consider this voyage to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the likes of which you will never see again. Savor it. Burn it into your memory to comfort you when times seem impossible. I took him under my arm, and we visited a shoreside wine cellar. There we sampled many vintages, taking delight in finding special ones whose pony barrels we could pack in straw for the long journey home. I didn't tell him that as soon as those chests hit the deck, they would be immune from breakage or spoiling, but that's what I did. Wines usually don't travel worth crap, but with the aid of the mother, that voyage was immune from inventory spoilage, which could easily take half the shipment. We gathered our food supplies and took on water for the voyage, then warped out of the harbor for our home port in the distant west. I did not discover for years that I and my crew had been instrumental in distributing the slow plague. It was not as brutal or painful as the Black Death. Usually 2 months after being exposed, the victims seemed to catch a cold with a bit of fever. Soon they grew tired, went to sleep, and their hearts stopped. Over 8 out of 10 perished of it. Daily I thanked the mother for her mercy. She could have taken us all. I had the captain point the ship back to Kuwait City. During our run, I spent my time succoring the plants we had aboard. It was a trip of nearly 4,000 miles, but they flew by. The configuration of the ship made it fleet of foot when running before the wind, and run we did. I dare say we were the fastest ship in the world for the time. We made the trip in just over 2 weeks by sailing the shortest distance, navigating by the stars. Our pilot owned one of the most valuable charts in the world for the time. I paid off the captain, crew, pilot, and the factor, keeping aboard only the cook and a security team of the biggest guys on the crew, which I rehired for the scandalous rate of $1 a day. Part of their job was to keep the plants in good condition. I petitioned the mother for her support in constructing a new temple and irrigating the temple farm's fields. She always seemed a bit giddy about a new temple and fields. I received the closest I'd ever gotten to an eager assent as I'd ever gotten. The shoreline near the city was predominantly salt marsh. It's a nasty bit of work as far as humans are concerned, but it does have its own ecology. It's a transition zone, so it fosters life. Go figure. However, less than a mile inland the land returns to barren rocky desert. Roughly 15 miles from the city, near the North Road, I arranged for a square mile of land to be set aside for religious purposes. A bit of gold smoothed the way tremendously. Once the obelisks marking the borders of the land were in place, I did the first consecration and blessing. Then blocks of stone came up from the sea bottom, where several Egyptian barges went down. I got a kick from stealing cut stone from an Egyptian god's projects to build a temple for the mother. I built as I did in Antioch, long and low with a high central nave and sanctuary. At the final blessing of the altar, a cup, dish, and lamp materialized, formed purely from the mother's will. I felt calm and fulfilled at the temple's completion, consecration, and purification. I knelt outside the rear door and gazed out at where the farm would be. With each breath, I felt the moisture grow and the earth soften beneath me. I lay down, cradled by the earth, and spoke the paean to the mother. Then, under the warm sun, I eased into an afternoon nap. On awakening, I stretched and smiled, feeling as if I were in the most comfortable of beds. I opened my eyes and laughed, for I was lying in a bower next to a small freshwater pool. The ground was covered in soft greenery while the air was perfumed by the mosses and flowers growing at the shoreline. I rose and walked to the pool, then filled my hand and drank. The water seemed freezing cold. It must have come from a spring. I raised my gaze to the land about me and saw nothing but green. It was like one of the old tales where an oasis formed, whole and perfect, overnight, confounding the traveler. A stone-paved path led out from the temple, between 2 fields, to a long, low stone building. I walked to it, finding homes for the farmers. To one side grew several orchards and a spice garden, all protected by stone fences. Behind the row housing lay a long vegetable garden, already covered by sprouts. Some were 6 and 7 inches long. I said a prayer giving thanks, then had a nasty little laugh to myself. My guards aboard ship were no doubt going noisily crazy trying to find out where all my precious plants were that I so carefully put into their charge. I wondered if they would cut and run or stand to face the music. Good question. I loaded up my warehouse in a pack, then started walking to town, considering with every other step the chance of the mother allowing me to come up with a buckboard wagon with a sprung seat. Without my knowing, behind me a green glow arched over the farm and temple, protecting it from any who would defile the temple or its environs. Once near the city, I approached a stable that held mules. After a bit of dickering, I bought 2 likely prospects. I did the speaks to animals spell and learned that one pair were a couple of wise asses, always trying to outdo each other. I bought the pair of them with a grin. If nothing else, I figured I'd get my money's worth from their entertainment value. Once out of view of the hostler, I whispered a little prayer under my breath and attempted to bring forth a buckboard wagon with leaf springs under the bench seat and a whipple tree to balance the load between 2 draft animals. I envisioned tall, iron-rimmed spoked wheels and a box bed. The mother was feeling generous as the spare, elegant lines of the buckboard silently shivered into being in front of me. I almost giggled to myself as the mules looked at the wagon, then looked at each other. I hadn't let on that I could understand them at that point. Did you just see what I saw? Nope. I didn't see it either. Did you? Nope. I'm cutting back on the fermented grain. Yup. Me too. That was it. I lost it. I laughed so hard that I had to hold onto the side of the wagon to stay standing. You two are great together. Don't worry about imagining things. I'm consecrated to the mother who allows me to use magic if I'm responsible about it. I called up a pair of chest harnesses that would allow them to pull the wagon with comparable ease, got all the harness work put together, called up a padded cushion for the bench seat, and climbed in. All right, guys. You'll notice something right away. There's no bits, snaffles, or even head harnesses. I know you're smart, so I'm going to lay it out for you. Just follow the G, ha, whoa, and let's go commands and you'll never see another bit from the working end again. Deal? They weren't stupid. Far from it. Okay, nice and slow to start and get used to this rig. Let's go. Well, it wasn't off to the races, but I was off my feet. It doesn't get much better than that for about the year 1200. They soon got used to the load, and picked it up a little until we were traveling at their normal walking pace. After almost an hour, we were at the dock. The guys were looking kind of white-faced, but they were holding on. I'm glad you guys didn't cut and run. Magic was used to move the plants so that they wouldn't take any more damage, so relax. There's nothing you could have done about it. Now, stand down for a while and ask the cook to get something together, hey? After that, I want to talk to you as a team, the cook too. I offered everyone a new job. I needed staff at the temple. The 8 sailors were experienced and had good heads on their shoulders, and the cook was a good fellow that didn't seem to anger easily, while doing a good job under conditions I wouldn't want to have taken on. I promised them all a silver a day until I ran out of silver. That got them laughing as they'd seen the chests full. I had everyone rack out until after dark while I did a little preliminary moving of cargo into my super pack. I didn't have any place for the mules to graze, so they got a half bucket of grain each, then a half bucket of beer and a bucket of water. After dark, I carried the pack aboard ship and we loaded it. The spell on it had 4 sections. One provided the capacity. The second preserved everything within the pack. The third ensured that the pack wouldn't weigh more than 100 pounds. The fourth organized everything so that I could bring out what I wanted. If I could sell one to every trader that came through town, I could retire, but long before I sold the first one, the mother would fry me like a squirrel on a high-tension power line. Besides, I was never promised that I could retire from this gig. Before heading out to the temple, I cast a repair and strengthen on the buckboard with a focus on letting it roll easily. I accidentally cast it on the mules as well as they were still hitched to the wagon. As soon as the spell completed, I knew that I'd done something unusual. The mother was cackling in the back of my head, while both mules looked at me and said, "Whoa, that was a rush." What was odd was, they were completely silent. I scratched my cheek, figuring that I'd just shot myself in the ass. What the hell was I going to do with a pair of telepathic mules? The mother always did say my mandate was to use my head, so I did. I cast the repair and strengthen on myself. They were right. What a head rush. On the way out of town, I gave a town crier a few coppers to advertise for farmers with families. We populated the wing of the temple that had the kitchen. I found a space that appeared to be dedicated for firewood storage. I took a little walk to look for a nice piece of hardwood and some small wood for kindling. I ran across a decent piece of wood that looked like it had fallen off of someone's load, as it was cut through with an axe at both ends, dry and made of a good hardwood. I found some thorny scrub that I tore out of the ground and kept the roots for kindling. Once back at the manger, I did my copy thing until we had a room full. I started a brewery and stacked the small kegs of wine against the walls, then unpacked the rest of my super pack into a storeroom. The larder went where the cook wanted it. Everyone got a nice wool rug for their room. The cook was ecstatic with his copper and iron pots and pans. He'd never seen a fireplace with a crane or swing arm before, but he picked right up on it. When I called up a reflecting oven with a spit and drippings pan, you'd have thought that I gave him the crown jewels. I had the guards sleeping in 2 rooms, along with a room for the cook and one for me. Within a month, we had enough farmers to fill the housing that had been set aside. It was a good thing that, because by then the gardens needed weeding and watering. We had one old fellow that we called our master gardener. He was the one that walked around feeling the soil, checking for moisture. A mature woman did the same for the chickens and livestock. I'd seen how farming day in and day out beat people down. With the mother's permission, I cast, repair, and strengthen on everyone within the boundaries of the farm and temple. I was sneaky though. I did it a bit at a time over half a month. It had been a while since I'd been to town. I harnessed the mules to the cart one day to see what was happening at the market. The streets were abattoirs. The dead lay everywhere. We had brought the plague back with us. 9 in 10 were dead. After the dying, I hardly saw anyone in town. It was like walking about at 3 in the morning, but the sun was high in the sky. I cast, repair, and strengthen spells over block after block of buildings, hoping to preserve whatever might be of value to others. I used my head by calling up a wheelbarrow, then borrowed our master gardener to visit all the background arbors and gardens we could access for plantings and seeds. I figured that he'd know if we were missing anything, and I made sure to get seeds or sprouts of various vines and flowers. That made him and the stillroom mistress very easy to deal with for quite a while. I, on the other hand, turned into a bit of a grump. I had my hands full designing and implementing bowers and glades for the mosses, vines, and flowers. After I'd done all the damage I could, I called on the mother to please bless and repair my poor attempts. Within a month, we had oak groves, cedar circles, and spring-fed ponds circled by lush grasses. The mother took over more land around our original holding and covered it in trees, bushes, and vines. Since it rarely rained in the area, she had brought forth large spring-fed pockets of sweet water that fed the plants from beneath. Vines soon grew to cover the temple, while sweet-smelling undergrowth filled in the area between the gate and the temple. I had a gray feeling. This was no longer my home. Once more I was destined to wander. I realized the curse of my touch from the mother. I was the wandering Jew. I found it hard to accept my path, yet my eyes were dry of tears. I had used my powers to bring others into the touch of the lady, but it was a spare and unforgiving garden that I planted for myself. I gathered my packs and returned to the docks. Once back aboard the ship, I called into being several chests, then called for lost or forgotten specie once again. Since the great dying had occurred, many caches went unclaimed. They came to me. I sorted the coins into various chests, then filled the ship's larder and called forth barrels of water. I cast a master repair and strengthen on the ship, which repaired all the sails, restored the ropes, then strengthened the masts and rudder to something like hard metal. The sea foam was ready to sail. I hired on a minimal crew, a pilot and a cook, because that was all I could find to hire. Against common wisdom, I asked the men to bring their families in case we decided not to return. We set sail south, then east. I wasn't after trade. I was seeking direction. South we sailed, then east through the lands of Siam. The winds were with us, as we had a cunning pilot that knew where the wind belts lay. Within a month we spotted Australia. It was a huge land. We sailed for 2 weeks while seeing it to starboard. Before long it passed in our wake. Even the storms held no fears for us. Our length and broad width kept us from capsizing, and our bespelled rigging held. We lost a few shelters aboard, but they were easily replaced. Soon we spotted another land, one that I knew as New Zealand in a different life. I sat off by myself and cast my memory back until I could draw a simple map of the islands. I had us land on a broad beach on the eastern shore of the southern island. I sat season on the ground and settled my robes about me. I took a deep breath to calm myself. I called out in prayer, "Mother, I wish to end my existence. Too many horrors have come to damage my soul. I beg of you to take me home. Your child wishes to know no more." I closed my eyes. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.